Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to quiet stone cloisters, where the air feels hushed and the rhythm of life is marked by bells, candles, and footsteps along shaded corridors. We move slowly beneath arches, where light falls like water across flagstones, and the silence is a living presence, shaping thought and breath alike. So before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. When we drift back into the Middle Ages, we often picture noisy tournaments, bustling markets, and the occasional plague cart rattling through a street. Yet alongside all that clamour, there were places wrapped in quiet, where the loudest sound might be a cough, the rustle of parchment, or the occasional bell tolling across stone corridors. These were the monasteries, strange little worlds, where silence was not only admired, but formally enforced, sometimes with the seriousness of a law court. A monastery was both a home and a kind of factory for souls, shaping men and sometimes women into vessels of prayer, labor, and contemplation. They were not quite prisons, though some medieval teenagers, dragged into the life, probably thought otherwise. Nor were they quite palaces, though the older abbeys accumulated wealth and land on a princely scale. They were suspended spaces, places where time ticked differently, measured by bells and candles rather than by markets and battles. For most, entering a monastery began with the ceremony of taking vows, though before that there was often a long period of testing whether one could handle the odd demands of monastic life. A would-be monk was sometimes as young as 7, handed over by hopeful parents who thought cloistered life would secure salvation points for the family. The child would be taught to read Latin psalms, to keep still, to sleep on hard surfaces, and to eat meals that were rarely exciting. The aim was to strip away the noisy personality of the outside world and replace it with a disciplined, humming regularity. Not all candidates made it through. Some fled, some were dismissed, and some no doubt sulked their way into adulthood under the shadow of the abbey walls. Once accepted, the daily schedule ran with impressive precision. A monk's day was divided into hours, not in the modern sense of 60 minutes on the clock, but in the ancient rhythm of canonical hour. The night was punctured by the toll of a bell calling everyone to matins, sometimes around 2 in the morning. Imagine stumbling through the dark, cold stone halls, half asleep, shuffling toward the choir stalls to chant psalm. After matins, they might be allowed a brief return to their straw pallets before the next round of prayers. Lauds came with the dawn. Through the day followed prime tesher, sext, nun, vespers, and compline, a liturgical marathon punctuating every few hours. To modern ears, it sounds exhausting. To medieval monks, it was simply the architecture of time itself. Meals were timed to these prayers, and they were not feasts. The stereotype of monks growing plump on wine and cheese has a kernel of truth in later centuries, but in many houses food was plain: bread, beans, vegetables, fish on fasting days, and little else. Meat was restricted in strict orders, though creative loopholes appeared. For example, waterfowl that swam were sometimes argued to be fish, and therefore fair game. The Benedictine rule, which shaped much of Western monastic life, allowed for moderation but not luxury. Silence during meals was standard. Instead of chatter, one monk would read aloud from scripture or a moral text, while the others chewed quietly. Imagine trying to digest your lentil stew while someone solemnly recites about the fleeting nature of earthly pleasures. It was not exactly lively dinner theatre. The physical environment of monasteries reflected this disciplined quiet. cloisters were designed as rectangular courtyards surrounded by covered walkways, providing a place for meditative pacing. These stone corridors echoed faintly with the soft scuff of sandals, the low rumble of chants, or perhaps the muted chirp of sparrows nesting in the rafters. The cloister was a safe container keeping monks inside, and the temptations of the outside world firmly outside. Walls were high, gates locked, and though monks occasionally dealt with lay people at the guest house or infirmary, most of daily life stayed behind those thick stone barriers. For someone today accustomed to buzzing phones and endless chatter, the cloistered soundscape would feel both eerie and strangely soothing. Yet the vow of silence was not absolute. Most orders allowed for practical conversation when necessary. A carpenter monk could not be expected to build a table without uttering some directions. But many monasteries restricted idle talk, jokes, and gossip. To work around this, sign languages developed. In some abbeys, there were hundreds of hand signals, enough to order food, request tools, or express basic needs, without breaking the atmosphere of quiet. It was like a medieval version of texting, efficient, silent, and probably overused by novices trying to sneak in jokes. The point was to keep voices tuned to prayer, not chat. Work filled the gaps between services. Labor varied depending on the wealth and focus of the monastery. Some monks tilled fields, brewed ale, or managed flocks of sheep. Others copied manuscripts in chilly scriptoria, their hands cramping over endless lines of Latin text. This copying was more than busy work. It preserved ancient literature through centuries, when much else could have been lost. Of course, not every monk was equally diligent. Marginal doodles survive. Little sketches of rabbits with crossbows, bored faces, or grotesque beasts sneaking through the letters. Even in the silence of the scriptorium, humor scratched its way onto the parchment. The contrast between the ascetic ideals and the material wealth of monasteries became obvious as centuries rolled on. By the 12th and 13th centuries, many abbeys controlled vast estates, collecting rents, selling wool, and lending money. Visitors sometimes found the abbots living almost like noble lords, with fine robes and large dining halls. Critics grumbled that these monks had strayed far from the rule of Saint Benedict, which had emphasized simplicity. Reform movements popped up, such as the Cistercians, who tried to strip away excess and return to stricter poverty. They built in remote valleys, wore undyed wool, and stressed hard manual labor. Yet even they accumulated land and wealth within a few generations. It seems the cloister could never fully detach from the gravitational pull of worldly riches. Still, the inner rhythm of daily life retained its character. The sound of bells was constant. They marked prayer times, meal times, work shifts, and even bedtime. Bells structured everything, pulling monks from whatever task they were doing back to the choir. Sleep was brief, often interrupted, and never cushioned by comfort. Beds were simple, rooms cold, blankets thin, but the intention was not torture. It was a way to keep bodies subdued so that minds would rise more easily toward prayer. Whether it worked or just left monks perpetually drowsy is hard to say. Chronic fatigue seems built into the lifestyle, though some adapted to it over time. Like people living near a busy railway, eventually stop hearing the trains. Education was another role of monasteries. They trained not only monks, but sometimes boys destined for clerical careers outside. In a world where literacy was rare, monasteries served as small islands of letters and learning. Libraries might house dozens, sometimes hundreds of volumes, chained to shelves for safekeeping. Books were precious, each one representing months of labor. Reading was often allowed, even in private study, since silent reading was less common in earlier centuries. So even in silence, the drone of voices murmuring Latin could fill the air, a constant undercurrent of sound that felt like silence only by contrast to the noisy outside world. Infirmaries within monasteries cared for the sick, both monks and sometimes outsiders. Healing was a mixture of prayer, herbs, and the usual medieval blend of remedies that look peculiar to us, but were serious efforts at the time. Caring for the sick was considered a form of serving Christ directly. The atmosphere in the infirmary would have been quieter still, hushed to allow for rest and prayer. The smell of herbs, wax, and damp stone likely hung in the air. Ailing monks might spend long hours gazing at the beams of the roof, while others chanted prayers nearby, the sound echoing faintly in the rafters. The vow of obedience tied all this together. Every monk submitted to the abbot, who held near absolute authority within the walls. The abbot could be gentle or strict, wise or foolish, beloved or resented, but his word was law. In theory, this mirrored obedience to God. In practice, it sometimes created tension. There were cases of abbots being deposed, scandals of mismanagement, even rumors of corruption. Yet the system endured, because hierarchy was as natural to medieval people as breathing. To modernize, the rigidity feels suffocating. To theirs, it provided structure and meaning. Even feast days, when rules were relaxed, were modest affairs. Music might swell, extra candles burn, food becomes slightly more generous. But compared to the riotous festivals outside monastery walls, they remained restrained. Imagine peasants dancing wildly at midsummer bonfires, while inside the monastery the monks added an extra loaf of bread and called it celebration. The gap between cloistered life and village revelry was stark. That contrast was intentional. Monks were to live apart, as visible reminders that the spiritual world mattered more than the fleeting pleasures of earth. Of course, monks were human. Records show moments of rebellion, laughter, even trouble. Some sneaked out, some broke vows, some grumbled constantly about rules. Silence could not erase personality entirely. The history of monasteries is sprinkled with little notes of absurdity. Monks fined for drunkenness, abbots feuding with bishops, novices running away at night. Yet overall, the system functioned for centuries, producing libraries, schools, music, art, and a distinct rhythm of life that shaped Europe in ways both quiet and profound. And so, when we picture those cloisters of silence, we might imagine the sun slanting through stone arches, shadows stretching across flagstones, the faint sound of chanting weaving through the air. We might drift along those corridors where conversation was forbidden, yet meaning flowed through gestures, bells, and prayers. It was not always peaceful in the sense of calm contentment, but it was steady, predictable, and deeply different from the noisy life beyond the walls. The monastery was a strange balance, worldly in its possessions, otherworldly in its aspirations, full of silence yet buzzing with murmurs, gestures, and ritual, a world wrapped in paradox, gently humming away behind high stone walls. In drifting further into that cloistered world, we find that silence did not simply mean the absence of sound, but also the shaping of thought. Monastic rules urged monks to avoid idle chatter, not only because words made noise, but because they created distraction. The idea was that each spoken sentence pulled the mind outward, scattering it like dry leaves in the wind, while silence kept it steady, inward, aligned with prayer. It was not a silence of nothingness. It was a silence brimming with intention, like a jar carefully filled with still water. And yet, the human mind is rarely still for long. Monks often admitted in their writings that during prayer their thoughts wandered toward food, family, or sleep. Even within the strict walls, silence was a daily struggle rather than a permanent achievement. The struggle with silence was matched by a struggle with time. Each hour of prayer had its appointed psalms and readings. These repeated endlessly, season after season, until the year itself felt like a circular track rather than a line. Lent came and went, Advent followed, feast days cycled in. The repetition lulled the body into familiarity. Days merged together, distinguished only by subtle changes in the liturgy or by the weather glimpsed through cloister arches. Some chroniclers noted that a monk could live through decades in the monastery and find it difficult to recall one particular day from another, as if time itself blurred into a soft haze of prayers and bells. In a way, this was the goal. Life was not meant to be memorable, but to prepare the soul for eternity, which itself was imagined as timeless. Yet, within that haze, work tugged constantly. Farming duties were especially important in rural monasteries. Fields had to be plowed, grain harvested, vines tended, monks bent over soil, hands dirty, habits often patched and muddy from toil. Silence did not prevent the creak of carts, the clatter of tools, or the calls of animals. Cows lowed, sheep bleated, and the occasional irritated goose reminded everyone that rural holiness was still a rural farm. These sounds mixed with the chants from the chapel, forming a peculiar soundtrack of sacred and ordinary for the medieval mind. This was fitting. Labor itself was considered prayer when done with the right spirit. The earth, like the soul, required constant attention to keep weeds from choking the harvest. Inside the scriptorium, the labor was quieter but equally demanding. Imagine a narrow bench, a slanted desk, a candle or oil lamp guttering nearby, and parchment stretched taut. Hours passed in scratching lines of text, dipped quills squeaking faintly. The air smelled of ink made from gore nuts and of vellum prepared from animal skins. It was hardly glamorous work. Hands cramped, eyes strained, and winter cold left fingers nearly numb. Mistakes could mean days of labor wasted, so concentration was intense. But the results, a carefully copied Bible, a treatise or even a classical text, carried a kind of immortality. Monks may not have sought fame, but their words and illustrations drifted centuries into the future, far beyond their cloisters. The silence of the cloister was occasionally pierced by music. Monks sang the divine office in chant, the long, flowing melodies without strict rhythm. Gregorian chant, as it later came to be called, was designed not for excitement, but for a kind of timeless drift. Notes stretched, voices layered, and the sound seemed to float upward into vaulted ceilings. For the sleepy novice struggling to stay awake during matins at 2 a.m, it may have felt more like a lullaby than a rousing hymn. But to outsiders who occasionally heard it, the chant carried a strange, otherworldly beauty. The monastery became a place where sound was disciplined, purified, made into an offering. Even silence had its music, as chants ended and the echo faded into stone walls. Visitors did appear, though they were carefully managed. Pilgrims might come seeking lodging, and monasteries often had guest houses separate from the cloister. Nobles visited too, sometimes bearing gifts in hopes of securing prayers for their souls. The contrast between the bustling world of visitors and the hushed life inside the cloister could be jarring. Guests might marvel at the strict rules or gossip about the wealth visible in fine chalices and elaborate vestments. Meanwhile, monks were reminded that outside life went on, full of temptations and distractions. Some monasteries allowed conversations with guests. Others kept them brief, filtered, or restricted to specific brothers trained to handle the task. It was like a medieval version of customer service, except the goal was not sales but spiritual edification. The rhythm of monastic seasons extended into agriculture and festivals. Harvest time meant long days in the fields. Winter meant more hours huddled indoors, often copying texts or weaving cloth. Feasts punctuated the gloom with extra food or candles, but always with restraint. The vow of poverty hovered over everything. Even when abbeys grew rich in lands, wealth might show up in architecture. Tall towers, cloisters of carved stone, churches filled with stained glass. But personal comfort remained minimal. Monks might sleep two to a cell, or in long dormitories with rows of pallets. Heat was scarce. Even the abbot might endure the same drafty chill as everyone else. The idea was that endurance of discomfort trained the soul to rely less on bodily pleasure. Of course, some abbots quietly bent the rules, but in theory, all shared the same cold nights. One aspect of monastic life that seems curious to modern ears is the communal bathroom arrangements. Many monasteries built long latrines with running water, sometimes perched dramatically over rivers. Silence was expected there too. Even in the most private human moments, the atmosphere of order and restraint pressed in. It was a reminder that every detail of life was folded into the same structure, ordered, regulated, and watched. The constant presence of others meant privacy was rare. A monk's inner world was perhaps his only real possession. Discipline came in many forms. Small infractions, like speaking without permission or dozing during prayers, could earn penances. These ranged from extra prayers to fasting, or kneeling in the chapter house while others filed past. The goal was correction, not cruelty, though humiliation was certainly part of it. Records show that discipline varied depending on the abbot's personality. Some were lenient, seeing faults as inevitable. Others were strict, cracking down on the smallest lapse. Monks themselves recorded both admiration and resentment toward their abbots, but the system held obedience was the virtue expected above all others. Meanwhile, monasteries played roles in local communities. They offered alms to the poor, sometimes distributed food, and cared for travelers. Their land management affected peasants who worked monastic fields or paid rents. Monks might be respected, resented, or both, depending on how heavily the abbey taxed its tenants. From inside, the cloister felt sealed off. From outside, it loomed large as an economic and social force. A medieval villager might hear the abbey bells daily, a constant reminder of prayers supposedly rising on behalf of everyone, even those who never set foot inside. Despite their isolation, monasteries were not immune to drama. Some became entangled in politics, siding with kings or popes during disputes. Others quarreled with neighboring bishops over authority. There were even monastic scandals with abbots accused of extravagance or worse. Reformers like Bernard of Clairvaux thundered against such abuses, urging a return to simplicity. His Cistercian vision emphasized stark churches, bare walls, and a stripped-down liturgy, a sharp contrast to the ornate Benedictine abbeys. Still, both traditions shared the core idea, a community ordered by silence, prayer, and work. The details shifted, but the rhythm endured. And so, as we continue drifting through the cloisters, the sense grows that silence itself was not empty. It was filled with bells, chants, footsteps, and the steady beat of regulated time. To live in such a world was to submit entirely to rhythm, to let the self dissolve into a communal hum. Whether this brought peace or quiet frustration likely varied by monk, yet the monasteries endured for centuries, not by accident but because this strange blend of silence, labor, and prayer proved sustainable. It may not have been easy, or even always holy, but it was steady, and in the Middle Ages steady counted for a great deal. Sliding deeper into the rhythms of the cloister, it becomes clear that while the monasteries aimed for constancy, life within their walls was anything but simple. Every day might seem outwardly the same, yet the long decades produced subtle changes, challenges, and even quiet revolts. The vow of stability, binding a monk to one monastery for life, meant that once admitted, he would likely never leave. Imagine that, the same cloister walls, the same bells, the same chants, stretching year after year, until death. Some embraced this as peace, others endured it as a slow confinement. Either way, stability was the anchor of the system, keeping monks rooted while the turbulent medieval world shifted beyond the walls. The vow of chastity was another cornerstone. It might sound obvious, but enforcing it in a community of men living closely together was a practical challenge. Rules forbade even casual physical contact, warning against unnecessary touches or even extended eye contact. Monks were told to avoid being alone together in places where temptation might arise, a rule that hints at the ongoing anxiety of enforcing purity in close quarters. Most monks managed through sheer discipline and the dulling repetition of daily tasks. Still, records note lapses, confessions, and the need for constant vigilance. The silence of the cloister may have muffled conversation, but inner desires remained stubbornly human. Wealth complicated chastity and poverty alike. As benefactors poured donations into abbeys, critics observed that some monks enjoyed comforts that seemed suspiciously unascetic. Rich meals, fine wine, and decorated vestments crept into certain houses, especially those tied to noble families. Satirists outside the cloister mocked fat monks waddling through abbey courtyards, hardly resembling models of restraint. Reformers agreed, pushing again and again for a stripping back of excess. The cycle was familiar. Strict poverty in the founding generation, gradual accumulation of wealth, and a later reform movement trying to pull things back. Monasteries were human institutions, after all, subject to the same rise and fall as any other. Despite these tensions, monasteries remained cultural centers. Their libraries preserved not only biblical texts, but also works of science, medicine, and philosophy. Aristotle crept into Western Europe through translations in monastic scriptoria. Medical treatises, often borrowed from Arabic sources, found their way onto vellum. This meant that even as monks claimed to withdraw from the world, they became conduits of knowledge, unintentionally feeding the intellectual revival of the 12th century. A young novice, scratching away at a parchment in silence, might not have realized he was preserving the seeds of scholastic philosophy. Yet in that quiet labor, history was being transmitted. Beyond books, monasteries also shaped the landscape itself. Many drained swamps, cleared forests, and introduced new farming techniques. Their silence extended outward into managed fields and ordered fish ponds. To a medieval traveler, the sight of a great abbey rising above cultivated land would signal not just spiritual authority, but also economic transformation. Monks were engineers as much as mystics, leaving behind fish pond systems, water mills, and terraced fields that endured for centuries. Silence, it turns out, could reshape not only minds, but also ecosystems. Inside the walls, however, the silence was fragile. Novices often struggled. Imagine a teenager torn from a village, suddenly plunged into a life of rigid schedules and minimal comforts. Homesickness was common. Monks recorded stories of novices weeping quietly in dormitories or sneaking food during fasts. Older brothers acted as mentors, guiding them gently or sometimes sternly toward discipline. Silence could feel suffocating to the young, but over time it became a second skin. Some adapted so thoroughly that later, when dealing with outsiders, they felt overwhelmed by ordinary noise. The monastery trained not only behavior but perception itself. The silence also created peculiar social dynamics. Without casual chatter, relationships had to be read through gestures, glances, the smallest of signals. A raised eyebrow, a subtle nod, or a hand sign could communicate volumes. Conflicts simmered beneath the quiet surface, occasionally erupting in dramatic chapter house confrontations. The chapter house was where monks gathered daily to read a section of the rule and to confess faults. Each brother might stand and admit to small infractions, falling asleep during matins, speaking out of turn, or mismanaging a task. The confessions were public, and punishments decided communally. It was less about individual guilt and more about preserving harmony. The silence of the cloister, in other words, was sustained by carefully managed bursts of speech in structured settings. Even death was woven into the silence. When a monk died, his body was prepared by his brothers, often wrapped simply in a shroud rather than an ornate coffin. Burial typically took place within the monastery grounds, sometimes in a cloister garth, the grassy center of the courtyard. The cycle of bells continued, prayers were said, and the community carried on with little interruption. Death was not extraordinary, it was part of the rhythm. Each monk lived knowing that his body would one day rest beneath the same stones he walked daily. The silence of the cloister was, in this way, a rehearsal for the silence of the grave. For all its gravity, monastic life was not devoid of small pleasures. Bees were kept for honey and wax. Gardens grew herbs both for medicine and flavor. The occasional feast day allowed for a richer meal, sometimes even meat if rules permitted. Monks brewed ale, which could be surprisingly strong, and drank it in moderation, though moderation, as records reveal, was a flexible concept. The monotony of daily meals was broken by these small indulgences, enough to mark the passage of time without tipping into extravagance. Even silence itself could feel pleasant, a calm background against which small joys stood out more brightly. Occasionally, silence cracked under external pressures. Raids, wars, or political upheavals could force monks to abandon their routines. Viking raids in earlier centuries sent terrified communities fleeing with their relics. Later, civil wars might drag abbeys into conflict as armies requisitioned supplies or occupied buildings. In such moments, the cloister's silence was shattered, replaced by the harsh realities of the outside world. Monks often recorded these intrusions with sorrow, longing for the restoration of order. For them, silence was not just a habit, but a shield against chaos, and when broken, it felt like the world had tilted off its axis. Despite all these interruptions, the cloisters endured. Their silence seeped into the wider imagination, inspiring lay people who dreamed of peace in a noisy world. Pilgrims sometimes described monasteries as havens of otherworldly calm, though one suspects they were shielded from the harsher realities of cold dormitories and strict discipline. Still, the image of the silent monk became a symbol of holiness. Even today, the idea of stepping into a cloister conjures the same sense of hushed reverence. The silence lingers across centuries, even if our modern lives rarely allow for such stillness. And so, As the centuries rolled forward, the monasteries became paradoxical monuments, wealthy yet ascetic, silent yet buzzing with murmured prayer, cut off from the world yet shaping it profoundly. Their silence was never absolute, but it was powerful enough to shape generations. It became not just a practice, but an atmosphere, one that seeped into stone, into ritual, and into memory. To enter a medieval monastery was to step into a different world, one where every sound and silence carried meaning, and where life itself was measured not by personal ambition, but by bells echoing through long stone corridors. In the broader sweep of medieval life, monasteries stood as both anomalies and anchors. Villages might rise and fall, lords feud, and kings tumble from their thrones. But the monastery often remained steady, its walls sheltering a rhythm that barely shifted from one century to the next. That steadiness was not always serene. It could be tedious, demanding, even suffocating. Yet, it provided a model of order in a world prone to chaos. The very act of keeping silence became a way of demonstrating control over words, over desires, and over time itself. Silence also shaped how monks related to God. Theologians of the age spoke of prayer as dialogue with the divine, yet monastic prayer often leaned more toward listening than speaking. Psalms were chanted, yes, but in between there was waiting, watching, and what one writer called the labor of the heart. The idea was that silence cleared space for God's voice, even if that voice was rarely dramatic. In practice, silence likely felt more like wrestling with distraction, the mind drifting toward aches in the knees or the lingering taste of onions from lunch. Still, the discipline of silence remained, shaping monks into men who could at least aim toward attentiveness, even if perfection eluded them. Architecture amplified this silence. Stone cloisters absorbed sound, muffling footsteps into soft echoes. High vaults turned chanting into a floating resonance that lingered long after the last syllable. The arrangement of space itself encouraged quiet. Narrow passages discouraged clusters of chatter. Gardens inside cloisters offered secluded corners for contemplation, where the only sounds were birds or the rustle of leaves. Builders knew what they were doing. They crafted environments that nudged the body into stillness and the mind into calm. Even visitors noticed, remarking on how a monastery felt different the moment one entered, like stepping into another climate, not of weather but of sound. Monasteries also imposed silence on the written word. Letters were carefully composed, formal, and sparse. Personal expression was limited, as the community mattered more than the individual voice. The few glimpses we have of individual personalities, scribes doodling in margins, monks writing wry comments about their stiff backs, stand out precisely because they broke through the flat surface of silence. These little rebellions remind us that monks were not machines of prayer, but human beings living under extraordinary constraint. The silence they kept was never pure. It was always negotiated, always under quiet tension. The vow of poverty layered onto silence in curious ways. Monks owned nothing personally. Even clothing was issued by the community. This meant that if one robe wore thin, another was provided, but not chosen. The loss of personal property created a leveling effect, where silence was matched by sameness. Rows of monks in identical habits looked less like individuals than like parts of a single body. This visual uniformity reinforced the sense that the cloister was a world apart, a collective organism humming along to the rhythm of bells and chants. Yet, the irony was never far away. While individuals were stripped of possessions, the institution itself could become immensely wealthy, its barns full, and its lands extensive. Silence about this contradiction was sometimes as enforced as silence at meals. Even the seasons imposed their own layers of sound and stillness. Winter brought long nights, when the hours before matins seemed endless, and the cold bit hard in unheated dormitories. Summer brought buzzing insects, open windows, and the faint sounds of village festivals drifting over monastery walls. Autumn meant rustling leaves in cloisters and the clatter of harvest carts. Each season had its acoustic texture, woven into the background of silence. To live in a monastery was to be acutely attuned to these subtleties, hearing in small shifts what others might dismiss. The silence was never absolute. It was relative, shaped by weather, labor, and the steady beat of ritual. At times, monks sought deeper withdrawal through eremitic practices, living alone in cells near the monastery or in remote hermitages under the loose authority of an abbey. These hermits took the silence of the cloister and intensified it to near total isolation. Some became famous for their austerity, attracting pilgrims who traveled precisely to break that silence by asking for prayers or advice. It was an irony baked into medieval spirituality. Silence drew attention, and attention shattered silence. Yet the hermit ideal endured, a reminder that for some, even the regulated quiet of the monastery was not enough. The silence of the monastery also extended into how monks viewed history. Chronicles written in abbeys often downplayed drama, focusing instead on lists of abbots, benefactors, and building projects. Wars and politics might be mentioned, but always in the margins. The center of their narrative was stability, not conflict. To modern readers, these chronicles can feel painfully dull, but that was the point. Dullness itself was a kind of victory, proof that the cloister had resisted the storms of the outside world. Even writing became an act of quiet persistence, reducing the world to a manageable hum. And yet, cracks always appeared. Stories survive of monks sneaking out to taverns, of abbots chastised for extravagance, of disputes erupting into physical fights despite the rule of silence. These stories stand out precisely because they broke the pattern, revealing the effort required to maintain silence in the first place. It was not a natural state, but a constructed one, fragile and easily undone. The wonder is not that silence was sometimes broken, but that it held as much as it did, century after century, through hundreds of communities across Europe. To walk through a cloister today, even in ruins, is to sense something of that atmosphere. The stones still hold echoes. The arches still frame light in ways that suggest calm. Tourists shuffle with lowered voices, almost instinctively, as if the silence lingers in the architecture itself. The monks are gone, their routines dissolved long ago, yet the impression of silence remains. It is perhaps their most enduring legacy, not the specific words they prayed or the wealth they amassed, but the idea that silence can be communal, structured, and lasting. It was silence not as absence but as presence, a force shaping lives and landscapes alike. Daily life in monasteries was not sealed off from the senses, even if speech was restrained. Smell was constant. The tang of beeswax from candles, the earthy odor of damp stone, the faint sourness of ink, the herbal scent of kitchens boiling cabbage or leeks. To modern sensibilities, the lack of soap and regular bathing might seem oppressive, but for monks it was ordinary. Their bodies, like their voices, were meant to be subdued, disciplined, and stripped of unnecessary indulgence. Even bathing, when permitted, was more about health than comfort. Silence did not mean sterility. It meant accepting a world of muted sensations, endured rather than chased. The cloistered diet, while plain, carried its own rhythms, fish dominated on fasting days, which filled more than half the calendar. Vegetables, bread and pulses were staples, while meat was often restricted to the sick or elderly. Cheese and eggs provided variety, though sometimes in monotonous repetition. Meals could feel ritualistic. The bell, the procession, the silent seating, the single monk reading aloud. For the hungry novice, the reader's voice might fade into background noise, while the mind focused on whether the stew contained even a hint of garlic. But the system itself carried symbolic weight. Words of scripture were digested alongside food, a mingling of physical and spiritual nourishment. Silence at meals was less about denying pleasure and more about turning even eating into prayer. Still, food rules generated loopholes and debates. The infamous question of whether beavers counted as fish because they lived in water was not mere medieval absurdity, but a serious matter of aligning diet with theology. Monks were inventive, and abbots often had to adjudicate these grey areas. Silence in the refectory may have hidden these disputes, but in the chapter house they surfaced as points of contention. The pursuit of holy quiet was always accompanied by human ingenuity in finding comfort without technically breaking the rules. Workshops hummed quietly within the cloister. Tailors mended habits, smiths sharpened tools, brewers prepared ale. Each task was carried out with minimal speech, producing a peculiar atmosphere of purposeful quiet. The soundscape was not empty, but filled with subdued noises: shears cutting cloth, hammers tapping, quills scratching. The silence shaped labor into something rhythmic, almost musical, without the need for conversation. Visitors might mistake this for eerie stillness, but for the monks it was simply daily life tuned to a softer register. One of the strangest silences was the legal one. Monasteries held courts over their lands, managing disputes among peasants who farmed their estates. Yet the monks themselves rarely participated in noisy argument. Trained stewards or representatives spoke for them. Within their own walls, disputes were handled through penance and ritualized confession, rather than shouting matches. The absence of quarrel was not natural, but carefully constructed. Silence, in this sense, was a political tool, masking conflict by channeling it into controlled forms. Peace was not the absence of disagreement, but the suppression of its volume. Music slipped through these silences in subtle ways. Chant was the official sound of prayer, but monasteries also nurtured polyphony, the layering of voices into complex harmonies. Some abbeys became centers of musical experimentation, pushing the boundaries of what silence could contain. To the outside world, monastic music seemed angelic, but inside, it was simply another duty, another repetition of notes and syllables. Still, the sheer persistence of chant, sung daily across centuries, left a cultural imprint so deep that its echoes still lull modern listeners into calm. The monks may have found it routine, but their silence produced one of the longest-lasting soundscapes of Western history. The relationship between silence and writing was equally profound. Scriptoria were not just workplaces. They were embodiments of the vow. The act of copying was itself a kind of silent prayer. Each letter formed on parchment was both communication and renunciation, a way of preserving words while refraining from personal speech. Marginal notes sometimes reveal a monk's exasperation, complaints about cold fingers, bad ink, or the dullness of the text. But even these small cracks show how silence was both embraced and endured. Without the discipline of the cloister, vast swaths of ancient learning might have vanished. The silence of the monks wrote history, even if the writers themselves faded into anonymity. At times, silence was interrupted deliberately, by ritual. The Easter Vigil, for example, began in darkness and quiet, until fire was kindled and chants swelled. The shift from silence to sound carried meaning, underscoring the drama of the liturgy. Silence was not merely absence, but contrast, heightening the impact of music, bells, or the spoken word. The monks may have lived in a low register, but they knew how to orchestrate moments of intensity. The cycle of quiet and sound gave their year its pulse. And then there were the infirmaries, where silence met suffering. Illness could not be muted, and the groans of the sick intruded on cloistered calm. Monks treated each other with herbs, prayers, and the limited medicine of the age. Silence here was tinged with compassion, broken gently to comfort the ill or to recite prayers for the dying. Death itself was a recurring visitor, and the community learned to absorb it into their routine. Bells tolled, chants rose, and the silence folded back around the absence. Even grief was restrained, shaped by ritual more than outcry. The monastery taught its members to die as they had lived, quietly, in the rhythm of prayer. Silence extended even into imagination. Medieval monks dreamed, sometimes literally, of heavenly choirs or visions of saints, but their writings often describe heaven as a place of perfect harmony, where sound and silence fused. Their earthly discipline was meant as a rehearsal for this eternal stillness. To live in a monastery was to practice for death, and for what they believed came after, whether comforting or oppressive. The silence trained them for a future where time itself would fall away. Thus, the daily life of the monastery, from meals to work to death, was bound together by silence. It was not an absolute silence, but a framework shaping every action into something intentional. The monks themselves may have grumbled, cheated, or laughed in moments of weakness, but the system held for centuries. Cloisters across Europe echoed with the same soft sounds, the scrape of sandals, the murmur of psalms, the toll of bells. The silence of the monastery was never empty, but full, layered, and alive, a paradox that sustained one of the most enduring institutions of the Middle Ages. The monastery also shaped silence through its treatment of visitors, who brought with them the noisy energy of the outside world. Pilgrims arrived with clattering shoes, whispered prayers, and occasionally loud demands for miracles. Yet they were quickly funneled into guest houses where hospitality was offered, but cloistered quiet was preserved. Nobles sometimes arrived in grand style, hoping to secure prayers for their souls or burial within abbey walls. Their retinues must have seemed loud and unruly to men, accustomed to hushed corridors. The monks, trained to keep silence, provided polite but minimal responses, showing hospitality without inviting chatter. In this way, silence became a social filter, keeping the sacred world distinct from the secular even when they overlap. Hospitals run by monasteries face similar challenges. The sick rarely kept quiet, and their suffering filled infirmaries with groans and murmurs. Yet even here, silence was maintained in its own fashion. Voices were hushed, care was tender, and prayer was constant. For the poor who found shelter in monastic hospitals, the quiet atmosphere must have felt both comforting and alien. Accustomed to noisy villages or bustling cities, they now lay in wards where the loudest sound was chanting drifting from a nearby chapel. Healing was imagined as both physical and spiritual, with silence itself contributing to the cure. Beyond the infirmary, silence framed the monastery's interactions with the natural world. Monks were farmers, foresters, and keepers of bees. Tending hives was a task particularly suited to quiet men, since bees dislike unnecessary disturbance. their honey-sweetened meager diets, and their wax-filled chapels with light. In the hush of a cloister, the hum of bees might have been the loudest sound in summer afternoon. The steady rhythm of nature, wind in trees, water in channels, birds in gardens, became part of the monastery's soundscape. Silence, in this sense, was never about erasing sound, but about living in tune with softer noises. Gardens inside cloisters were not ornamental in the modern sense, but practical and spiritual. Herbs grew for medicine, vegetables for meals, and flowers sometimes for liturgy. Walking through these gardens offered moments of quiet contemplation. With paths designed for slow pacing, silence allowed monks to notice details: fragrance of mint, buzzing of insects, the shifting of light through leaves that might escape hurried minds. In later centuries, writers compared cloisters to the Garden of Eden, a controlled paradise maintained by labor and discipline. The silence of the garden was cultivated as carefully as the plants themselves. Yet, not every sound was welcome. Monastic rules warned against laughter, which was seen as disruptive to seriousness. Smiles were allowed, but loud laughter suggested lack of control. This did not mean monks never laughed. Human nature is hard to restrain. Marginal doodles in manuscripts, dancing animals, mischievous faces, suggest that humor found its way into cloisters, even if it had to be disguised in drawings rather than in bursts of noisy mirth. Silence tried to tame joy, but joy occasionally slipped through in sketches, pranks, or the suppressed chuckles of novices. Silence was also gendered. While male monasteries often drew more attention, female convents practiced similar rules. Nuns observed silence in dormitories, refectories, and cloisters, though their daily work often included weaving, embroidery, and teaching young girls. Silence shaped their lives too, though with unique tensions. Women religious faced scrutiny from both church authorities and secular families, often accused of being too strict or not strict enough. Their silence became a defense, a way of avoiding scandal, but also a cage that confined them within strict limits. For both men and women, silence functioned as both discipline and shield. Silence could even extend into writing wills and memorials. Many nobles donated land or money to monasteries in exchange for prayers. The monks' side of this exchange was a promise of spoken intercession, but most of their labor remained quiet, lighting candles, copying names into necrologies, sitting in prayer. The silence of these rituals carried weight in medieval belief. Even without words, monks were thought to sustain souls, whispering them into salvation through their disciplined quiet. In this way, silence had economic value, drawing steady streams of donations that supported monastic wealth. As centuries passed, monasteries grew ever more elaborate. Gothic architecture lifted churches higher, stained glass-filled windows with colored light, and silence resonated in vast stone chambers. The experience of chanting in such spaces must have been overwhelming. The human voice swallowed by architecture, silence magnified by echo. Monks were not deaf to beauty, and though their rules warned against excess, the grandeur of their churches suggested that silence itself could be made monumental. The walls did not simply contain silence, they amplified it, turning absence into awe. At times, silence collided with politics. Kings and popes demanded loyalty, armies marched, and abbeys found themselves caught between powers. Monks might be forced to provide supplies or endure sieges. The silence of the cloister could not withstand cannon fire or royal decree. Yet even then, abbots insisted on preserving the internal rhythm of prayer, chanting while soldiers camped outside. Records describe such stubborn continuity with quiet pride. For monks, keeping silence in the face of chaos was a kind of resistance, proof that their vocation transcended earthly turmoil. And through all this, silence remained the thread binding life together. It was not perfection. Monks faltered, abbots erred, novices rebelled. But the attempt itself endured day after day, year after year. Bells called, sandals shuffled, chants drifted, and silence wrapped the cloister like a cloak. It was both fragile and resilient, easily broken by laughter or argument, yet strong enough to shape centuries of life. The cloisters of silence became symbols of constancy in a noisy and unpredictable medieval world, their echoes lingering long after the monks themselves were gone. The silence of the monastery reached beyond its walls, filtering into how people imagined holiness itself. For villages nearby, the abbey bells were reminders that somewhere close, a group of men or women were praying on their behalf. The quiet discipline of the cloister was believed to spill over into the surrounding countryside, offering protection and blessing. When harvests failed or storms raged, peasants might look to the monastery with a mix of hope and frustration. Hope that its prayers would help, frustration when those prayers seemed not to work. Silence, in this sense, was both reassuring and suspicious, comforting because it suggested constancy, unsettling because it left room for doubt. The abbey's role in education also spread the influence of silence. Schools attached to monasteries trained boys in Latin grammar, rhetoric, and logic, often preparing them for clerical life. Lessons were delivered in heavily structured environments, with speaking tightly controlled, whispering, or joking could earn punishment, reinforcing the monastic ideal that words carried weight and should never be wasted. Some of Europe's greatest medieval thinkers passed through such schools, carrying the habit of disciplined silence into universities and cathedrals. The intellectual world of the Middle Ages, often noisy with debate, was quietly underpinned by the silent training grounds of monasteries. Inside the monastery, silence shaped memory. Without constant conversation, events were remembered differently, filtered through ritual and prayer rather than through chatter. A novice might look back on years of cloistered life and recall not individual conversations, but the steady rhythm of bells and psalms. Silence flattened experience into patterns, erasing details, but engraving structure. This explains why so many monastic chronicles are dry lists rather than vivid stories. Life in silence was less about narrative and more about repetition. History itself was written in the same cadence as daily prayer, steady, restrained, and stripped of drama. The vow of silence, however partial, also highlighted inequality. Not everyone in a monastery was a choir monk, bound to hours of chanting. Lay brothers performed much of the manual labor, farming, building, tending livestock, and while they too observed silence, their experience was different. They worked longer hours in the fields, with fewer breaks for prayer, and their silence was more practical than contemplative. Over time, tension grew between choir monks, who focused on liturgy, and lay brothers, who carried the physical burden. This quiet divide revealed itself in architecture, separate cloisters, separate dormitories, and even separate refectories. Silence, while shared, was not the same for all. The discipline of silence also created peculiar psychological effects. Some monks reported experiencing what we might call sensory sharpness, the ability to notice tiny sounds or subtle shifts in tone. In an environment where voices were rare, the creak of a door or the sigh of a neighbor could feel amplified. This heightened sensitivity might have been spiritualized as attentiveness to God, though in practice it was probably just the human brain adjusting to a low sound environment. Silence did not erase noise but magnified it, making every sound feel significant. Festivals provided one of the few sanctioned breaks on major feast days. Rules relaxed slightly, meals were richer, laughter more tolerated, conversation allowed within limits. Yet even here, silence hovered. The joy was careful, measured, always pulled back before it grew too loud. The contrast between monastic feasts and village festivals could not have been greater. Outside, peasants danced, shouted, and sang late into the night. Inside, monks allowed themselves an extra dish of fish and a bit more chant. The silence of the monastery was resilient enough to survive even celebration, bending but never breaking. Over time, silence itself became a contested idea. Some reformers argued that true holiness required even stricter quiet, while others insisted that excessive restraint bred hypocrisy. Debates about how much talking was acceptable reveal just how central silence had become to monastic identity. It was not merely a rule, but a defining feature, one that monks and outsiders alike used to measure spiritual seriousness. The monastery known for its silence was admired, while one known for chatter was suspect. The soundscape became a form of reputation, echoing far beyond cloister walls. Art also reflected this ideal. Illuminated manuscripts from monasteries often depicted serene figures, their mouths closed, eyes lifted in contemplation, even when margins erupted with playful doodles. The main scenes radiated stillness, architecture echoed this too. Cloisters framed empty space, chapels magnified the hush between chants, dormitories enforced rest without speech. Silence became an aesthetic, carved into stone and painted on vellum, turning absence into beauty. To live in such spaces was to be constantly reminded that restraint itself was sacred. As the centuries moved forward, silence came under pressure from new forces. Universities grew louder with debate, towns buzzed with commerce, and even within monasteries increased wealth and responsibility required more communication. Yet the ideal endured. Reform movements returned again and again to the theme of silence, seeking to recapture what seemed to have slipped away. The dream of a perfect cloister, hushed and harmonious, never quite matched reality but continued to inspire. In the end, silence was less about erasing sound than about teaching men and women to hear differently. It was a tool for focus, a framework for prayer, a boundary against the noise of the world. Monks may not have achieved unbroken quiet, but their attempts reshaped culture, leaving behind not only manuscripts and architecture, but also an enduring idea that silence cultivated and communal could itself be a form of devotion. Silence, though, was never meant to last forever. By the later Middle Ages, the stability of monasteries began to fray. Wealth drew criticism, politics intruded, and new religious movements challenged the cloistered ideal. Mendicant friars, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, rejected the silence of enclosed walls for preaching in city streets. They spoke loudly where monks prayed quietly, turning the balance of holiness toward the marketplace rather than the cloister. The contrast was striking. Monks in silence, friars in sermons, both claiming to serve God, but in opposite ways. The silence of monasteries, once a dominant model of devotion, now had competition. Yet, the enduring power of silence cannot be dismissed. Even as new movements spread, monasteries remained places of retreat. Kings retired there in old age. Nobles sent their daughters to convents, and pilgrims still visited abbeys for a taste of otherworldly quiet. The idea of silence as sacred never faded, even when the practice wavered. In fact, the more noisy and chaotic the outside world became, the more monasteries symbolized an unattainable calm. Silence turned into both nostalgia and aspiration, a reminder of something always just out of reach. The Protestant Reformation brought more violent ruptures across northern Europe. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized, their silence broken by hammers and fires. Cloisters fell into ruin, bells melted down, libraries scattered. The sudden absence of silence must have been deafening, as centuries of ritualized quiet gave way to the roar of change. In Catholic lands, however, monasteries persisted, sometimes renewed by reform. Silence was not extinguished, but redistributed, flourishing in some places while vanishing in others. The geography of silence shifted, leaving behind scars and echoes. Even in ruin, cloisters carried their aura. Travelers in later centuries described walking through abandoned abbeys, marveling at how the stones still seemed hushed. Birds nested in crumbling arches, weeds sprouted in chapter houses. Yet the sense of silence lingered. Romantic poets of the 18th and 19th centuries found in these ruins a kind of haunted stillness, imagining the ghosts of monks pacing silently through broken cloisters. Silence, once enforced by vows, became a poetic atmosphere, a relic of a world both admired and criticized. Modern visitors to preserved monasteries often report the same sensation. Even when filled with tourists, cloisters have a way of drawing voices down to whispers. The architecture insists on it, as though the stones themselves still remember centuries of restraint. The silence has outlived the men who kept it, turning into cultural memory. We imagine monks moving in slow procession, candles flickering, chants echoing. Whether or not reality matched the dream, silence became myth as much as practice, shaping how we think about the Middle Ages as a whole. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of monastic silence. It was never perfect, never unbroken, and never entirely free of contradiction. Yet it created a rhythm that sustained communities for centuries, preserved knowledge, shaped landscapes, and influenced imagination. Silence was not empty. It was full of structure, labor, prayer, and even rebellion. It was the sound of sandals scuffing on stone, of bells marking time, of pages turning in scriptoria. It was imperfect and human, yet powerful enough to shape history. When we picture the Middle Ages, we often conjure images of knights, castles, and wars. But just as central were the quiet figures moving through cloisters, their lives defined by regulated silence. They remind us that history is not only made in battles and speeches, but also in the long, steady hum of restraint. The monasteries may be ruins now, with their silence broken by cameras and footsteps. Yet their influence lingers in how we think about devotion, time, and even the value of quiet itself. The cloisters of silence, in all their paradox and persistence, still echo across centuries, a reminder that sometimes history is written not in noise but in the deliberate attempt to still it. One flame flickers out, but another sparks in the dark, daring us to follow. And with it begins a story more haunting, more hidden, and impossible to ignore. This is the murmuring canals of Venice, water, trade, and shadows. Venice does not so much sit on the water as it drifts upon it. A city half dream and half engineering project, built where the Adriatic Sea seeps into shallow lagoons. Its streets are canals. Its foundations are timber piles driven into mud. and its palaces rise like mirages on shifting tides. To walk Venice is to float through history, even if your feet remain on stone. And through those canals, narrow, winding, murmuring with every tide, flowed not only gondolas, but the fortunes, secrets, and shadows of a republic that was both improbable and enduring. The city's origin feels improbable enough. Refugees fled into the marshes during invasions in the early Middle Ages, seeking safety where armies would not bother to follow. The islands were muddy and unstable, the channels unpredictable, the salt air unforgiving, yet necessity turned into permanence. Piles of alder and larch, hammered deep into silt, created foundations stable enough for stone. Gradually, huts gave way to churches, and churches to palaces. Venice became less a desperate refuge and more a deliberate gamble. If you cannot beat geography, you may as well recruit it. The gamble worked. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Venice had become a thriving hub, not because it possessed fertile land, it had almost none, but because it commanded the water. The lagoons were its moat, and the sea its highway. Where others looked at marsh and tide and saw hardship, Venetians saw advantage. They turned their lack of fields into a hunger for trade, their lack of walls into a reliance on canals. It is often said that necessity is the mother of invention. In Venice, necessity birthed an entire republic balanced on timber and tide. The canals murmured with this duality, safety and danger, opportunity and risk. They were arteries of commerce, carrying spice-laden galleys back from Alexandria and Constantinople. They were also corridors of shadow, where assassins could vanish under bridges and political intrigue could be whispered into the night air. For every gilded barge carrying ambassadors in pomp, there was a narrow boat gliding silently past shuttered palaces. Water never forgets, but it rarely tells what it knows. Trade defined everything. Without farmland, Venice imported its food, relying on grain from the Pulse Valley, Sicily, and eventually the Black Sea. What it exported was access. The city became a broker between East and West, channeling spices, silks, and precious goods from the Levant into Europe. This position made Venetian merchants rich and their city powerful. Wealth built palaces whose Gothic windows still dripped with tracery, churches where Byzantine mosaics glittered, and an arsenal where ships could be built with assembly line speeds centuries before industrial factories. All of it rode on the water, every plank and stone reflecting in the canals that murmured below. Yet the shadows never left. Venice thrived on diplomacy as much as commerce, balancing between empires, always pragmatic, often ruthless. The Republic was proud of its stability, its doge elected for life, its councils filled with patricians, its bureaucracy thick with scribes. But behind the facade lay intrigue. The canals carried rumors as easily as goods. A whisper overheard on a bridge could mean fortune or ruin. Shadows deepened in narrow waterways, where gondolas passed silently, lanterns extinguished. At the right moment, trade brought wealth, but also envy, rivalry, and betrayal. Daily life in Venice reflected this mixture of splendor and precariousness. Gondolas ferried nobles to banquets, while barges brought in barrels of wine and sacks of grain. Fishermen mended nets on quays, while patricians debated treaties in marble halls. The same water lapped against palaces and warehouses alike, indifferent to wealth. Flood tides swept into ground floors, reminding Venetians that their city was always one storm away from disaster. Yet the people carried on, adapting with walkways, waterproofing, and resignation. Living in Venice meant living with risk as a permanent neighbor. The architecture, too, spoke this dual language. Palaces opened with ornate facades facing canals, as if to perform wealth to the passing world, but their interiors often contained narrow courtyards and guarded passages. Churches glimmered with mosaics of heaven, yet their floors tilted with the settling of foundations. Venice was always magnificent and always sinking, both realities held together by stubborn determination. The canals murmured beneath, lapping gently, reminding every resident that glory here was always fragile, perched on wood and water. To approach Venice, even now, is to feel this contradiction from the water. The city looks eternal, its domes and campaniles rising proudly. Step closer, and you see crumbling brick, damp walls, and moss clinging to steps that vanish into green water. It is at once dazzling and decaying, triumphant and threatened. That was as true in the Middle Ages as it is today. The murmuring canals are not just scenery but testimony, voices of a city that rose because of water and that must always live with its consequences. Thus, from its improbable beginnings in marsh and tide, Venice grew into a republic whose power and fragility were inseparable. The canals carried merchants and messengers, gondoliers and ghosts. They whispered wealth and plotted shadows. They reflected palaces while threatening to swallow them, and in that uneasy balance, Venice found its identity, a city of water, trade, and shadows, murmuring endlessly beneath the stone facades. Sliding deeper into the daily hum of the city, Venice's canals reveal themselves not as picturesque curiosities, but as the city's streets, its lifelines, to move through Venice, meant to move by water. Gondolas, today, may be mostly for tourists, but in the medieval and Renaissance city they were practical, essential vehicles, varied in shape and size depending on use. A noble might recline beneath a canopy, shaded from the sun and from unwanted stares, while a merchant's boat would be piled high with crates, sacks, or even livestock. Narrow canals echoed with the creak of oars, the slap of water against stone, and the occasional shouted warning as two boats squeezed past one another under a low bridge. Food was always the most pressing cargo. Venice could not feed itself. Its lagoon soil was too salty and unstable for much beyond small gardens and orchards. Grain had to come in from elsewhere, and the Republic developed a finely tuned system to ensure it did. Barges carried grain from the Po Valley and from Ferrara downriver, while great galleys sailed from Sicily, Crete, and eventually the Black Sea, their holds filled with wheat. The state regulated this trade with an eye to survive. Grain offices monitored imports, set prices, and stored reserves to be distributed in times of shortage. For Venetians, bread was never taken for granted. It was a visible reminder that the city floated not only on water, but also on an endless stream of imported food. Markets along the canals bustled with this dependence. The Rialto became the city's commercial heart, where merchants unloaded goods from boats directly onto stalls. Grain, fruit, spices, cloth, and fish were all laid out side by side, the smell of salt water mixing with the scent of pepper and saffron. Bargaining filled the air, as did the clatter of scales and the grunts of men hauling crates. The Rialto was less glamorous than Mark Square, but it was just as vital, a marketplace murmuring with accents from across the Mediterranean. Alongside the grain came luxuries, and these were what made Venice rich. Silks from Byzantium, spices from India, glassware made in Murano, furs from the north, all passed through Venetian hands. Merchants grew wealthy as brokers, marking up goods for European buyers eager for anything exotic. Their houses along the Grand Canal advertised that wealth with ornate facades Yet those facades were also advertisements of credit and power. Behind every carved window lay the accounts of risk, storms at sea, piracy and fluctuating demand. Trade promised riches, but always at the cost of uncertainty. The gondolas themselves mirrored this duality of splendor and shadow. Their long, sleek designs made them swift and maneuverable, but also discreet. At night, when lanterns were dimmed, a gondola could slip silently along a side canal, carrying a masked passenger to a rendezvous or a meeting best kept private. The same boat that ferried a noblewoman to a feast could, under different circumstances, deliver an assassin to a back door. Venice's reputation for intrigue owed as much to its boats as to its palaces. Social life unfolded along the canals as well. Nobles paraded in barges during festivals, their vessels draped with silks and banners, a floating theatre of wealth. The annual marriage of Venice to the sea, the Sposalizio del Mare, saw the Doge sail out on the Bucentoro, a great golden barge, and cast a ring into the waves, declaring the city's eternal union with the waters that sustained it. The ceremony was grand, but beneath its ritual shimmered a practical truth. Venice's fortune depended on those waters, and every grain shipment, every spice cargo was a renewal of the vow. Yet life along the canals was not all grandeur. Fishermen's boats came in daily with catches of eels, crabs, and sardines, destined for humble kitchens. Washerwomen stood at steps scrubbing clothes in the lagoon's brackish water. Children splashed along the edges, while dogs nosed through the refuse that inevitably accumulated. The same water that brought wealth also carried waste, and the smell of canals in summer could remind even the wealthiest noble of the city's precarious hygiene. To live in Venice meant to live with beauty and squalor tangled together, inseparable as tide and ebb. The city's leaders knew that water was both their blessing and their potential downfall. Regulations governed the canals: who could dock where, when cleaning was required, how waste was to be managed. The arsenal, that great shipyard of the Republic, was linked directly to the canals, ensuring that war galleys could be launched swiftly. The same waterways that carried grain barges could, in times of danger, fill with armed ships. Venice's survival strategy was not only economic but also military, and the canals were flexible enough to serve both. Thus, the murmuring canals of Venice were never idle. They carried food for the hungry, luxuries for the wealthy, soldiers for the Republic, secrets for the ambitious, and waste for the indifferent. They whispered constantly of survival, reminding the city that its lifeblood flowed not from fields but from the water that lapped ceaselessly at its stones. Gondolas and grain, barges and bargainers, all moved to the same rhythm, the murmur of water against wood, the steady song of a city that chose to live not on solid ground, but on shifting tide. Sliding now along the Grand Canal, the city's great palaces rise on either side like a procession of stone, each facade catching the light, each whispering stories of power and compromise. To the casual visitor, they may look like endless repetitions of Gothic arches and Byzantine mosaics, but to Venetians of the past, they were statements of rank, credit, and ambition. Every pointed arch and marble column was an announcement. This family is strong. This family trades widely. This family can be trusted or feared. The wealth that built these palaces came from trade, and so their fronts always faced the water. Barges could glide directly up to the entrances, unloading spices, silks, or sacks of grain into courtyards within. To passers-by, the facades gleamed with patterned marble, tracery carved as delicately as lace, and windows arranged in symmetrical rows. Inside, however, the spaces often felt more utilitarian. Warehouses and storerooms sat beside frescoed halls, Business accounts were kept within sight of family portraits, and narrow staircases linked opulent reception rooms to dim cellars. These palaces were not only homes but also banks, warehouses, and offices, their elegance masking the calculations of commerce. But with wealth came shadows. Rival families plotted against each other, their palaces sometimes becoming fortresses during feuds. Bridges over narrow canals could be strategic choke points, and assassins hired in secret might emerge from gondolas under cover of darkness. The canals made quick escape routes as well as elegant entrances. Gossip swirled as thickly as incense in San Marco, and it was not unusual for political rivalries to spill into whispers of poisoning, betrayal, or sudden disappearances. Venice's political system prided itself on stability. The Doge, elected for life, was more figurehead than autocrat, his powers carefully checked by councils of patricians. Decisions were made in the labyrinth of the Great Council, the Senate, and the Council of Ten. The latter, infamous in reputation, was tasked with protecting state security, and its methods leaned toward secrecy and ruthlessness. Informants whispered into the ear of the council, and denunciations could be slipped anonymously into the mouths of stone lions, the so-called Bocchi di Leone. To be accused was often to be condemned, the verdict carried out quietly, sometimes with a splash into the very canals that had brought fortune to the city. The palaces therefore held a strange duality, grand by day, shadowed by night. Festive banquets and processions filled their halls, but shutters closed quickly when danger loomed. Masks, which Venetians wore not only during Carnival, but throughout the year in certain circumstances, blurred identities further. A masked figure stepping into a gondola at dusk might be a noblewoman going to a ball, or a conspirator heading to a clandestine meeting. The canals, with their soft echoes, kept secrets well. Yet amidst intrigue, Venice also cultivated spectacle. Wealthy families funded churches, patronized painters, and sponsored festivals to reinforce their prestige. Their palaces hosted musicians and poets. Their facades displayed imported marbles in green, red, and gold. The balance was delicate. A family might be plotting in one wing of a palace while commissioning art in another. The city thrived on this mixture of rivalry and display, each palace reflecting both pride and paranoia. For ordinary Venetians, these shadows were simply part of the landscape. Farngoliers ferried passengers without asking questions. Servants passed messages between households. Neighbors speculated, but rarely intervened. Silence was often the safest response. The canals murmured with stories that were half seen, half heard, and often best left unspoken. Even today, drifting along the Grand Canal at twilight, one senses this duality. The facades glow in the fading light, beautiful and fragile, while the water laps at their foundations with a steady murmur. Behind every window, one imagines, were rooms where fortunes were tallied, alliances forged, and sometimes betrayals planned. The grandeur and the shadow were inseparable, two sides of the same coin. Both carried on the waters that sustained the city. Thus, the palaces of Venice were more than architectural marvels. They were instruments of reputation, backdrops for intrigue, and participants in the Republic's delicate balance of wealth and fear. Their reflections shimmered on the canals, doubling their beauty in daylight and doubling their secrets in the dark. And always the water whispered beneath them, carrying the memory of both feast and conspiracy in its murmuring tide. Sliding away from the facades of patrician palaces, the pulse of Venice beat loudest in its markets. The Rialto, perched on the bend of the Grand Canal, was less glamorous than St. Mark's Square, but far more vital. It was here that grain was measured, spices weighed, cloth inspected, and credit negotiated. If the palaces were the city's display of wealth, the Rialto was the workshop where wealth was made. Its arcades hummed from dawn until dusk, the murmur of bargaining rising and falling like the tide. The smell of the place struck first. Fish laid out on stone slabs, eels coiled in baskets, crabs clattering in nets, their brine mingling with the sweetness of figs and oranges, the sharpness of garlic, and the earthy musk of grain. Behind these everyday wares came the exotic bundles of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves carried from Alexandria, or calicut silk folded in shimmering bolts from China, and glass beads from Murano sparkling like fragments of sunlight. Each item told a story of distance and risk, storms weathered, bribes paid, pirates avoided. The Rialto was as much a theatre of danger as of abundance. Merchants haggled in a polyglot murmur. Venetian, Greek, Arabic, and Slavic voices intermingled, each bargaining over goods that might end up in Paris, London, or Cairo. Credit was as important as cargo, and the Rialto's bankers kept ledgers as thick as chronicles. Bills of exchange, promissory notes, and contracts changed hands, all greased by trust and calculation. A merchant might never see the ship that carried his goods, but he could profit from them through careful investment. In this way, Venice perfected the art of trading on paper as much as on water. Grain, though less glamorous than spices, was the true heartbeat of the market. The Republic watched its grain supply like a hawk, fearful of famine in a city without fields. Grain offices kept meticulous accounts, and state inspectors patrolled the market to prevent hoarding or cheating. Shipments were unloaded straight into warehouses, the sacks stacked high under guard. Bread was life, and bread depended on ships sliding daily into the city's watery veins. Without those barges, all the gold-threaded silks in the Rialto would have meant nothing. Yet the Rialto was more than commerce. It was also gossip. News traveled with goods, and rumors of war, plague, or opportunity spread quickly in the arcades. A single whisper could raise or ruin fortunes, just as a sudden rumor of piracy in the Adriatic could collapse credit overnight. Men gathered in knots to trade information as eagerly as they traded cloth or pepper. Venice thrived on secrecy, but it also thrived on rumor, and the Rialto was its loudest whispering gallery. Murano's glass trade added another layer of brilliance to the market's murmur. Glassmakers were confined to the island of Murano for fear of fire in the city, but their products flooded the Rialto goblets, mirrors, beads, chandeliers. Venice guarded the secrets of glassmaking fiercely, forbidding craftsmen from leaving under penalty of death. Their skills were treasures as valuable as the spices carried in from the east. A merchant could dazzle foreign buyers, not only with pepper and silk, but with glassware that seemed to capture light itself. Amid all this bustle, ordinary Venetians wove through the crowd. Housewives selected vegetables, sailors looked for cheap meals, children darted between stalls. The market was not reserved for nobles or merchants alone. It was the city's common ground, where hunger and luxury brushed shoulders. A fish bought in the Rialto might end up grilled in a patrician palace or boiled in a humble kitchen, but it passed through the same hands and the same canal-side stalls. At times the Rialto took on a darker hue. Debtors unable to pay were publicly shamed, their misfortune displayed as a warning to others. Thieves risked swift justice, often at the hands of guards who patrolled the arcades. Fires, always a danger in a city of wood and cloth, sometimes swept through the market, leaving charred ruins that were quickly rebuilt. The Rialto endured, its hum returning as soon as the smoke cleared, because it had to without it. Venice would starve and its coffers would empty, and always the canals murmured beneath the arcades. Boats unloaded at dawn, filled again at dusk, their cargoes reflected in rippling water. The Grand Canal itself seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the market, carrying whispers downstream to the palaces, upriver to the arsenal, and outward to the lagoon where galleys waited. The Rialto was not simply a place, it was a rhythm, one that bound nobles and peasants, locals and foreigners into a single murmuring chorus of trade. In Venice, to live was to trade, and to trade was to listen. To the clang of scales, the cries of vendors, the shuffle of boats, and the quiet hiss of water against stone. The Rialto gathered all of it into one space, a market of murmurs, where fortunes rose and fell with every tide. Drifting from the Rialto's chatter toward the eastern edge of the city, the canals begin to echo with a different kind of murmur. The clang of hammers, the hiss of furnaces, the groan of timber being shaped. This was the Venetian arsenal, the great shipyard of the Republic, a place as vital to the city's survival as any palace or church. While gondolas glided through narrow canals and barges crowded the markets, here entire fleets were born, launched straight into the lagoon like swarms of wooden insects, ready to carry Venice's fortune and shadow abroad. The arsenal was enormous, a city within the city, its walls stretched for kilometers, enclosing workshops, forges, warehouses, rope walks, and dock. Within these walls, thousands of workers, carpenters, caulkers, rope makers, sail weavers, smiths, labored in a rhythm that was both industrial and ritual. By the 13th century, Venice had perfected a system so efficient that foreign visitors compared it to a machine. Ships could be built, not in years but in days, each section crafted by specialized crews, then passed along to the next, like an early assembly line centuries before such ideas were named. The galleys built here were the backbone of Venice's trade and defense, long, narrow, and swift, carried spices from Alexandria and Constantinople, grain from Sicily and the Black Sea, and soldiers when diplomacy failed. Each galley depended on banks of oarsmen, their sweat, the engine that drove the ship across calm seas and through storms alike. Many of these rowers were not free men, but convicts or captives, chained to benches, their labor as grim as it was essential. For them, Venice's glory meant blistered hands and aching backs, their lives spent to keep the Republic afloat. The arsenal was more than shipyard. It was symbol, its secrecy was legendary, its gates guarded, its techniques closely held. To outsiders, it seemed both awe-inspiring and ominous, a place where the city's true power was forged, away from the glitter of palaces and the murmur of markets. Ambassadors were sometimes shown the arsenal as a demonstration of Venice's might, a calculated display of order and efficiency. To see row upon row of galleys under construction, each at a different stage of completion, was to understand that Venice's power lay not just in merchants' ledgers but in oars and sails, ready to enforce the will of the Republic. Yet, even here, shadows crept in. The arsenal's workforce was vast, and strikes, quarrels, or drunkenness could ripple through the shipyard like cracks in a hull. Supplies of timber from the mainland were vulnerable to interruption, whether by poor harvest or political strife, and the reliance on chained oarsmen was both a strength and a weakness. Reliable in numbers, but fragile in morale, their desperation always one spark away from revolt. The arsenal was disciplined, but discipline is rarely absolute. Life within its walls was harsh, but steady. Rope walks stretched so long that workers seemed to vanish into perspective, twisting hemp into chords that would one day snap taut under sail. Forges roared with the shaping of anchors and nails, sparks flying like fireflies. Carpenters bent timbers into hulls, their mallets sounding like drums. The air smelled of pitch and salt, sweat and smoke. It was not a place of beauty, but it was indispensable. The beating industrial heart of the lagoon. When galleys launched, the city celebrated. Ships slid down ramps into the water. Crews assembled, banners unfurled. The Doge and councils might attend, blessing the fleet before it departed on campaign or convoy. To see a line of newly built galleys, their prows sharp and their decks bristling with oars, was to glimpse both the pride and the anxiety of the Republic. Every ship was investment, every voyage risk, every return uncertain. The murmuring canals carried not only gondolas and barges, but also the reflections of fleets that might or might not come home. The Arsenal's reach extended into Venetian identity. To be Venetian was to be tied, directly or indirectly, to the merchants invested in voyages. Nobles sat on councils that debated naval policy. Workers in the arsenal shaped planks and sails. And even the humblest citizen depended on the grain and goods those ships carried back. The Republic lived by water, and its heartbeat was measured in the rhythm of oars striking waves. Even now, walking near the old arsenal walls, one can almost hear it, the creak of wood, the chant of rowers, the hammer against iron. The palaces may dazzle, the markets may murmur, but the arsenal was where Venice declared its will to endure. Its shadows remind us that behind every golden facade lay the labor of thousands, the sweat of workers, the strain of chained men, and the relentless murmur of oars against the sea. Sliding now from the clang of the arsenal into the softer, more secretive world of Carnival, Venice shows yet another face, hidden, disguised, half-whispered. If the Rialto was the city's workshop, and the arsenal its beating heart, then Carnival was its mask, a long, elaborate season, when identity blurred, whispers grew louder, and shadows lengthened across the canals. Masks in Venice were not limited to Carnival alone. They appeared year-round at gambling houses, in theatres, even in political life. But during Carnival, which stretched not for days but often for months, the entire city seemed to wear a disguise. Streets filled with figures in white masks and black cloaks, their expressions blank, their voices muffled. The most common was the botta, covering the whole face and shaped to allow eating and drinking without removal. Behind it, noble or commoner, man or woman, might vanish into anonymity. A gondolier carrying a masked passenger could not know whether he ferried a senator or a servant, a lady of means or someone playing the part. This anonymity was liberating, but also dangerous. Freed from the constraints of identity, Venetians indulged in pleasures normally restrained by custom or law. Gambling tables overflowed, masked figures exchanged flirtations, and feasts grew more extravagant as Lent approached. The canals carried boats draped in fabric, filled with laughter and music, their lanterns swaying over the water like fireflies. The whole city became a stage, and every participant, both actor and audience. Yet Carnival was also a political safety valve. Venice's rulers understood that their republic, tightly controlled by councils and patricians, needed outlets for tension. By permitting anonymity, they allowed frustrations to dissolve into laughter, parody, and indulgence. Satirical plays mocked nobles, whispered jokes pricked at authority, and all was tolerated, so long as it remained within the bounds of the mask. When Carnival ended, masks came off, and order returned. The shadows were permitted, then absorbed like water rising and falling with the tide. Still, The masks could conceal more than playful mischief. Assassinations, secret meetings, forbidden affairs, all could slip more easily into the fabric of carnival. A masked gondola ride at night might be innocent, or it might be deadly. The city's Council of 10 kept watch, their informants blending into the same masked crowds, listening for whispers that crossed the line from parody to conspiracy. Venice's obsession with secrecy found fertile ground in the anonymity of carnival, where every laugh carried an undertone of unease. Beyond carnival, masks also became symbols of Venice itself. Visitors from abroad marveled at the sight of entire streets filled with identical white faces, a city of blank stares gliding over bridges and into palaces. For some, it was unsettling, for others, intoxicating. In either case, the mask became Venice's calling card, the visible expression of a city that thrived on ambiguity, trade, and shadows. The theatres reinforced this spirit. Commedia dell'arte, with its stock characters and masked performers, thrived in Venetian playhouses. Audiences laughed at Harlequin, sighed at lovers, and saw themselves caricatured in figures like the miserly Pantalone. The stage, like the city, was a place where truth and disguise coexisted, where humour softened critique, and where masks allowed both satire and escape. For the common Venetian, carnival was both indulgence and spectacle. Markets sold masks of every style, from simple paper to gilded creations with feathers and jewels. Musicians played in squares, acrobats performed on rope bridges strung between palaces, and fireworks lit the lagoon. The canals themselves became part of the theatre, filled with floating parties that drifted through the night. For a few weeks, the murmuring waters reflected not intrigue or commerce, but laughter, though even laughter carried shadows beneath its surface. Today, carnival is often remembered for its costumes and photographs, but in its original form it was an expression of Venice's genius for balance. By cloaking identity, it allowed freedom without dismantling order. By permitting parody, it diffused criticism. By indulging appetite, it prepared for restraint. The masks were not frivolous decorations. They were tools of governance as much as of pleasure, woven into the Republic's careful choreography of liberty and control. And always, beneath the masks, the canals murmured. Gondolas slipped silently under bridges, lanterns bobbing, music drifting faintly. The city that lived by water also lived by disguise, its reflections as uncertain as its faces. Carnival made Venice visible in its truest form, beautiful, theatrical, ambiguous, and always half hidden in shadow, drifting away from masks and laughter. The canals also carried darker murmurs, those of illness, loss, and the fragile line between survival and ruin. For all its wealth and resilience, Venice was never immune to plague. Indeed, its very strength as a hub of trade made it vulnerable, as ships brought not only spices and silks, but also disease. When plague arrived, it seeped through the canals as silently as the tide, leaving markets hushed and palaces shuttered. The Black Death of the mid-14th century struck Venice with brutal force. Tens of thousands died, their bodies ferried across the lagoon to mass graves. Gondolas that once carried merchants and nobles now bore the sick and the dead, their dark hulls sliding silently beneath bridges. The bustling Rialto fell quiet, its stalls abandoned, its gossip replaced by the toll of bells. Even the arsenal slowed, its forges and rope walks unable to drown out the sound of mourning. The murmuring canals seemed to whisper only of absence. In response, Venice did what it always did. It adapted, Out of plague grew innovation. The Republic established one of the earliest systems of quarantine, building islands dedicated to isolation. Ships arriving from abroad were held in the lagoon for 40 days. Quaranta journey to ensure that no hidden sickness entered the city. Lazarettos rose on small islands, where travelers and goods were inspected, burned or confined. These measures, harsh but effective, spread to the rest of Europe and left Venice with a reputation for pragmatic, if cold, ingenuity. Religious devotion deepened in times of plague, and Venice left monuments to its vows. The Church of the Redentor, designed by Palladio, was built in thanks for deliverance from a 16th century epidemic. Each year, Venetians crossed a temporary bridge of boats to give thanks, the procession a reminder that gratitude must follow survival. The Basilica of Santa Maria della Salute rose in the 17th century for the same reason, its great dome still dominating the skyline, where the Grand Canal meets the lagoon. These churches were not only houses of prayer, but also symbols of resilience, stone embodiments of promises made during terror. But plague left scars as well as monuments. Families vanished entirely, their palaces abandoned or absorbed by rivals. The population shrank, and with it, the workforce that powered the arsenal and the markets. Children were left orphaned, and noble lineages extinguished in silence. The shadows of Carnival seemed harmless by comparison to the shadows left by empty streets and silent canals. Venice's wealth could not buy immunity, and its beauty could not shield it. Even in recovery, the fear lingered. The gondoliers, who once joked and sang, became wary of passengers. Merchants eyed incoming ships with suspicion. Priests blessed the dying as quickly as they could, then turned to the next. And yet, life returned. Offerings were made in churches, markets reopened, and palaces filled once more with light. The city endured by accepting that survival was always provisional, always balanced on water, always vulnerable to tides beyond its control. To walk in Venice during plague was to feel both silence and persistence. Bells tolled, but so did hammers in the arsenal. Gondolas carried the dead, but they also carried grain. Priests buried bodies, but they also blessed marriages. The city grieved and continued, its murmuring canals bearing witness to both despair and determination. Even centuries later, the memory of plague shapes the city. The grand churches of Thanksgiving still stand, their domes reflected in the canals. The lazarettos remain on their islands, silent reminders of fear and discipline. The rhythm of quarantine, born of necessity, echoes faintly in modern measures of health and safety. Venice taught the world that silence and control could be tools of survival, even when shadows grew darkest. Thus, the canals murmured not only of trade and intrigue, but also of death and deliverance. They whispered of gondolas, heavy with loss, of bells echoing across water, of vows made in desperation and kept in stone. In plague, as in prosperity, Venice endured, its silence as eloquent as its laughter, its shadows as revealing as its light, gliding at last into the quieter stretches of this story. Venice shows itself not only as a city of commerce, intrigue and survival, but as a reflection, literally and figuratively, of all those layers resting on water. The canals murmur with echoes of centuries, and in their shifting ripples one can glimpse both splendor and fragility, triumph and decline. For every palazzo that dazzled with Gothic tracery and Byzantine mosaics, the water below reminded Venetians of impermanence, its tides creeping into doorways, its damp rising through walls. The very foundations of the city, wooden piles driven into mud, were a wager against time. The wager succeeded for centuries, long enough for Venice to command trade routes, to dazzle ambassadors, to build domes and churches that still rise against the horizon. Yet the murmur of the canals always reminded that no triumph was absolute. The water that brought fortune could, with a single storm or flood, also threaten ruin. Trade had been the lifeblood, but it was also shadowed by risk. Galleys left the arsenal filled with spices, silks, and hopes of profit, but storms or corsairs might send them to the bottom of the sea. Grain filled the markets, yet every Venetian knew how narrow the margin was between abundance and hunger. Wealth piled up in palaces, but envy and rivalry turned facades into masks for intrigue. The canals carried both treasure and treachery, never choosing between the two. Masks, too, became part of that reflection. Carnival, with its blank white faces and hidden identities, mirrored the city itself, beautiful, theatrical, ambiguous. The mask could free or conceal, amuse or threaten, just as the city could dazzle or deceive. Plague added its own shadow, silencing the markets, darkening the gondolas, reminding all that beneath wealth and laughter lay vulnerability. The canals murmured through it all, carrying the memory of death as faithfully as they carried spices from the east. And yet, Venice endured. It endured not by denying change, but by folding it into ritual. Quarantine islands turned fear into system. Thanksgiving churches turned desperation into stone. Carnival turned satire into spectacle. The Republic itself balanced power through councils and committees, weaving intrigue into governance. Venice lived by negotiation, not only with empires abroad, but with the very water under its feet. Even now, when gondolas drift past palaces, lit for tourists, when carnival costumes glitter for cameras, when high tides flood St. Mark's Square, the same murmurs continue. The city remains both dazzling and precarious, as it always was. Its canals are still streets, still lifelines, still shadows. They whisper of merchants and assassins, of feasts and funerals, of vows and betrayals. To listen to them is to hear, not one story, but a chorus, layered and unending. Perhaps that is Venice's true lesson, that beauty and fragility are inseparable, that trade and shadow walk hand in hand, that survival lies not in stability, but in balance. The city has always been a reflection, its facades mirrored in water, its glory mirrored in risk, its laughter mirrored in silence. To drift through its canals is to drift through centuries of murmurs, each tide carrying the same truth. Venice lives because it floats, and it floats because it never forgets the water beneath. Endings are never final, they're stepping stones. The past leaves us clues, echoes, and whispers that carry us straight into the next twist in the long, unbroken chain of history. This is the curious case of the Cadaver Synod. When a dead pope stood trial, history has no shortage of oddities. But even in that crowded gallery, the Cadaver Synod stands out with an unsettling glow. Imagine, if you will, a courtroom in the heart of medieval Rome, banners hanging, bishops assembled, judges in solemn rows, and at the center, seated on a throne, dressed in papal robes, is not a living pope at all, but a corpse, stiff, robed, silent, and very much dead. This was not rumor or satire. It happened in 807, in the Lateran Basilica, when Pope Stephen VI brought the body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, to trial. It is the sort of event that makes even seasoned historians pause. Europe was full of strange trials and strange punishments, but rarely did they involve hauling a 9-month-old corpse from its grave, dressing it in vestments, and demanding that it answer questions. Yet, that is what happened, and the memory of it lingers like a half-faded nightmare. The Cadaver Synod was not just grotesque theatre, it was a window into the turbulence of the papacy in the late 9th century, when power struggles turned Rome into a stage where even the dead could not escape politics. To understand how such a thing could happen, one must first look at Formosus himself. Born in the early 9th century, he rose steadily through the ranks of the church, earning a reputation as a capable administrator and diplomat. He became Bishop of Porto, one of the suburbicarian sees around Rome, and he served as a papal legate to Bulgaria, where he impressed local rulers enough that they requested him as their archbishop. That ambition, however, brought him into conflict with Rome, where canon law frowned upon bishops hopping from one seat to another. Formosus found himself accused of ambition and overreach, a charge that would follow him long after his death. Despite these early troubles, Formosus was elected pope in 8091, at a time when Rome was entangled in the politics of the Carolingian collapse. The once great Frankish Empire was fragmenting, and rival claimants to the imperial crown sought legitimacy from the papacy. Formosus aligned himself with Arnulf of Carinthia, a German king, against Lambert of Spoleto, the young son of the powerful Duke Guy of Spoleto. By crowning Arnulf's emperor in 1896, Formosus set himself firmly against the Spoleto family, a decision that would prove fatal to his reputation, if not to his body. Formosus did not live long after Arnulf's coronation. He died in April 1896, leaving behind a Rome divided and simmering. Arnulf himself suffered a stroke and withdrew from Italy, leaving Lambert and his mother, Ageltrude, to reclaim influence in Rome. The city had always been prone to faction, and the papacy was often less a spiritual office than a prize for competing families and foreign rulers. Formosus's choice of allegiance had made enemies powerful enough to reach into his grave. Enter Pope Stephen VI, elected with Spolo's support. His reign was marked by instability, and perhaps by his own insecurity about legitimacy. To strengthen his position with Lambert and Ageltrude, Stephen turned against Formosus. The decision was radical, even by Roman standards. He ordered that Formosus's body be exhumed and placed on trial for violations of canon law. Nearly a year after burial, the corpse was dragged from its tomb, dressed in papal robes, and seated on a throne in the Lateran Basilica. The scene must have been ghastly. Accounts describe the body as already decayed, its skin blackened, its joints stiff to keep it upright. Attendants, sometimes called deacons of the trial, were assigned to prop it in place. A deacon also acted as the corpse's defense, answering the charges on behalf of the dead pope. Stephen himself presided, his voice filling the basilica as he accused the corpse before him. Bishops sat as judges, though their expressions, one imagines, must have betrayed more than a little unease. The charges were technical, but damning in their time. Formosus was accused of having coveted the papacy while still Bishop of Porto, of having violated canon law by abandoning his see, and of having performed illegitimate ordinations. In essence, Stephen argued that everything Formosus had done as pope was null, every ordination invalid, every act tainted. It was not merely an attack on a corpse, but on the entire legacy of his rival. The corpse, unsurprisingly, did not respond. The deacon mumbled its defense, but Stephen's fury carried the day. The trial concluded with a conviction. Formosus's acts as pope were declared void, his body stripped of papal vestments, his fingers, the ones used in blessings, cut off, and his corpse dragged through the streets before being dumped in a pauper's grave. Later, it was even thrown into the Tiber, as if to erase him entirely. This was no mere grotesque episode. The Cadaver Synod exposed the raw politics of the papacy in its most literal form. In Rome of the late 9th century, the struggle for legitimacy was so fierce that even the dead could be summoned to answer for their choices. To Stephen VI and the Spoleto faction, the corpse of Formosus was not a body, but a symbol, a reminder of defiance that had to be humiliated and erased. Yet, as history often proves, such excesses rarely end well. Rome was horrified. Ordinary people, already weary of factional violence, recoiled at the spectacle of a pope's corpse desecrated in the Lateran. Rumors spread that disasters followed, including a literal earthquake that shook the city not long after the trial. For many, it seemed divine judgment on the madness of putting a dead man on trial. The Cadaver Synod was both absurd and tragic, a sign of how unstable and factional the papacy had become. It was also a prelude to more turmoil, for Stephen's victory over a corpse would soon turn hollow. His trial of Formus did not settle disputes, it only deepened them, setting Rome on a path of vengeance and reversal that would leave the city shaken for years to come. Sliding forward from that grotesque moment in the Lateran Basilica, the story lingers on Pope Stephen VI himself. He was not the most powerful of popes, nor the longest reigning, but history has preserved his name almost exclusively for one decision: to drag a dead man into court. To understand him, one must see the tangled context of the papacy in the late 9th century, where popes were less spiritual shepherds than precarious players in a Roman game of survival. Stephen came to the papal throne in 1896, only a few months after the death of Formosus. His election was backed by Lambert of Spoleto and Lambert's formidable mother, Adiltrude, who were determined to restore their family's prestige after Formosus had crowned their rival, Arnulf of Carinthia. The Spoleto faction needed a pope who would confirm their authority, and Stephen, Bishop of Anagani before his election, fit the role. Once enthroned, he moved quickly to undo the legacy of Formosus, perhaps to demonstrate loyalty to his patrons, perhaps also to protect his own fragile legitimacy. By then, Rome had become a city of factions, with noble families and foreign rulers jockeying for control of the papacy. The Lateran Palace, the papal residence, was less a holy court than a contested prize. Violence simmered just beneath the surface. Mobs could form quickly, loyalties shifted with each power vacuum, and even the sanctity of the Pope's office did little to protect him from intrigue. In this climate, Stephen's decision to target Formosus, even after death, was both outrageous and oddly logical. By condemning his predecessor, he delegitimized Arnulf's coronation, reaffirmed Lambert's claim to imperial dignity, and bound himself more firmly to the Spoleto cause. The Cadaver Synod was the extreme expression of this logic. Accounts describe Stephen as consumed with fury during the proceedings, shouting accusations at the corpse propped up in its chair. Whether this was sincere anger or carefully staged performance is impossible to know, but either way the effect was unsettling. The bishops who served as judges acquiesced, some perhaps out of fear, others out of calculation. Few dared oppose the Pope while Lambert's forces stood behind him. The verdict was sweeping. By declaring Formosus's acts null, Stephen struck not only at his rival's memory, but at the very structure of the church. Dozens of bishops and clergy ordained by Formosus suddenly found their status in question. Were their ordinations valid? Were the sacraments they had performed legitimate? Entire dioceses faced chaos as their leader's authority was thrown into doubt. For ordinary Christians, this meant uncertainty in the most basic aspects of faith: marriages, baptisms, and masses performed under Formus's hand seemed to vanish into a legal void. Stephen, however, pressed on. Formus's corpse was stripped of papal vestments, the blessing fingers severed, the body dragged across Rome, and finally cast into the Tiber. To humiliate a dead rival was one thing. To declare his entire papacy void was another. The sheer excess of the act shocked even those used to Roman factionalism. The reaction was immediate and bitter. Many Romans were scandalized, seeing the trial as sacrilege. Formus, though controversial in life, had been pope, and desecrating his corpse seemed to dishonor not just him, but the papacy itself. Stories spread that the Tiber rejected the corpse, washing it back to shore where the faithful retrieved it in secret. Some claimed miracles occurred at his remains, transforming the disgraced pope into a martyr in the eyes of the people. Whether fact or legend, the tales reflected popular outrage. Stephen's position quickly weakened. The Spoleto faction could protect him only so far, and Rome's mood turned against him. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, mobs rose in protest. Stephen was imprisoned, stripped of his office, and eventually strangled in his cell in 87. The same year he staged the trial. His downfall was as abrupt as his rise. His reign remembered less for governance than for one macabre spectacle. The irony was sharp. In attempting to erase Formosus, Stephen had ensured that both their names would be remembered together forever. History might have forgotten a brief and embattled pope like Stephen VI, but no one forgets the man who put a corpse on trial. The Cadaver Synod became the epitome of papal excess, cited for centuries as proof of the dangers of factionalism and the fragility of the papacy in Rome's turbulent age. Yet the story did not end with Stephen's death. The papacy itself was thrown into a cycle of reversals. Later popes annulled the Cadaver Synod, rehabilitated Formus, and restored the legitimacy of his ordinations. Then still later popes, pressured by shifting factions, once again condemned or praised him, the pendulum swinging back and forth with bewildering speed. Rome seemed unable to let go of the corpse, revisiting its memory again and again, as if trying to exorcise a ghost that refused to depart. The Cadaver Synod, then, was not only an event, but a symbol. It revealed how deeply politics had consumed the papacy, how fragile authority had become, and how even the dignity of death offered no escape from factional revenge. The murmurs of that trial still echo across centuries, reminding us that Rome in the late 9th century was a place where stability was fragile, justice was theatre, and even the dead could be summoned into the shadows of power. Floating onward from Stephen VI's downfall, the strange saga of Formus's corpse did not end with the Cadaver Synod. Rome, restless as ever, could not leave the matter buried. The body itself, once tossed into the Tiber, became a kind of wandering symbol, drifting between dishonor and sanctity as factions rose and fell. If Stephen had meant to silence his rival by humiliation, the effect was the opposite. Formus became a ghost in the papal imagination, summoned repeatedly in courtrooms and councils, long after his body had decayed. Legend tells that after being cast into the river, the corpse was recovered by sympathetic monks or pious laymen. Some said it washed ashore and was carried in secret to a safer resting place. Others claimed miracles gathered around his remains, healings, visions, or unexplained lights in the night sky. While historians treat these reports with caution, they reveal how quickly public disgust at the Cadaver Synod transformed into reverence. The people who had recoiled at Stephen's grotesque trial now looked at Formus not as a disgraced pope, but as a victim of sacrilege. The corpse that had been paraded in humiliation began to attract whispers of martyrdom. Rome's clergy, too, felt the consequences. If Formosus's ordinations were invalid, as Stephen had ruled, the legitimacy of half the Italian episcopate was in doubt. Bishops consecrated by him faced accusations that they were not truly bishops, their authority evaporating into absurdity. Priests ordained by him worried that the sacraments they had performed might be void. This theological and practical chaos was intolerable, and succeeding popes scrambled to restore stability. After Stephen's death, Pope Romanus quickly annulled the Cadaver Synod, rehabilitating Formosus and reinstating the validity of his acts. But Romanus reigned only briefly, mere months before being deposed. His successor, Theodore II, lasting only 20 days, nonetheless took decisive action. He ordered that Formosus's body be retrieved and reburied with honor in St. Peter's Basilica. This symbolic act mattered immensely, for it transformed the corpse once dragged through Rome into a relic, restored to dignity. Theodore's short reign was enough to signal a turn away from Stephen's excess, yet stability did not hold. In 89 Pope John IX convened synods that once more annulled the Cadaver Synod, reaffirming Formosus's legitimacy and forbidding the future trial of corpses. It seemed a final word, no more digging up the dead for political theatre, but Rome was never good at leaving things settled. In 904, Pope Sergius III, a former ally of Stephen VI, reversed everything, yet again, recondemning Formosus and reaffirming the Cadaver Synod's verdict. Even though Formosus remained safely in his grave this time, his ghost was summoned once more to serve factional agendas. The papacy's constant reversals reveal how fragile its authority had become. Instead of unshakable continuity, Rome projected the image of an office buffeted by storms, swayed by whichever faction gained the upper hand. The corpse of Formus became the pivot around which these battles turned, an unwilling participant in a decades-long tug of war. Each new pope seemed to feel obliged to take a stance. Was Formosus legitimate or not? Could his ordination stand, or should they collapse? The ghost of the Cadaver Synod haunted their councils, forcing Rome to revisit the same grotesque drama again and again. For ordinary Romans, the effect was bewildering. One year, Formosus was damned. The next, he was blessed. One pope threw his corpse into the river. Another raised it to honor. A third condemned him again. Faithful Christians, who sought stability in the sacraments, were left wondering how the whims of factions could unsettle even the most basic questions of legitimacy. The image of a corpse on trial lingered in memory, a symbol of how far politics had invaded the sacred. Even centuries later, the story of Formus was retold as a cautionary tale. Chroniclers of the High Middle Ages shook their heads at the Cadaver Synod, using it as an example of papal corruption and excess. Protestants in the Reformation era gleefully pointed to it as proof that Rome had always been tainted by absurdity. Modern historians, sifting through sparse sources, still find it unsettling, a reminder that truth in medieval politics was often stranger than fiction. And so the ghost of Formosus remained, silent, immovable, yet endlessly talked about. His body was finally at rest in St. Peter's, but his name refused to lie quietly. Each new wave of politics stirred him up again, as though the papacy could not fully rid itself of the memory of that corpse propped on a throne. The Cadaver Synod had been meant to erase him, but it ensured the opposite, that he would never be forgotten. his ghost haunting Rome's councils long after the candles of that grotesque trial had burned out, drifting from the ghost of Formosus into the broader scene. The Cadaver Synod makes more sense when placed inside the turbulent frame of 9th century Rome. The city was no serene seat of papal holiness. It was a patchwork of rival noble families, foreign armies passing through, and a papacy that was less a steady beacon than a contested prize. In such an atmosphere, stability was the rarest commodity of all. The old order of the Carolingian Empire had collapsed into fragments, and with its collapse came a scramble for legitimacy. Kings and dukes wanted the crown of emperor, but only the Pope could confer it. That meant whoever controlled the papacy controlled the gateway to imperial authority. This made Rome a magnet for factions, each eager to install their pope, each willing to bend canon law and custom if it secured advantage. It also meant the popes themselves were often pawns, elected less for spiritual stature than for political usefulness. The Sploto family exemplified this pattern. Sploto and later his son Lambert wanted imperial crowns, and Formosus' support for Arnulf of Carinthia had blocked. When Pope Stephen VI staged the Cadaver Synod, he was acting as the Sploto's instrument, attempting to erase that betrayal retroactively. Rome's politics were not content with victories in life. They demanded satisfaction even from the dead. The Roman people, meanwhile, lived amid constant upheaval. Mobs could be rallied quickly by noble patrons, and violence was never far from the surface. The papal palace itself was vulnerable to raids, and more than one pope ended his reign by being imprisoned, exiled, or strangled. The office carried dignity, but little safety. To walk the streets of Rome in the late 9th century was to see soldiers stationed near basilicas, banners of rival lords fluttering above fortified houses, and gossip spreading faster than grain shipments. Amid this turmoil, the church's spiritual duties continued, though often overshadowed by politics. Priests still said Mass, monks still kept their rule, pilgrims still visited holy shrines. But the spectacle of the papacy in chaos cast long shadows. How could Rome claim to guard Christendom when it could not even keep popes safe in their graves? The Cadaver Synod became emblematic not only of Stephen the Sextus, but of an age when the sacred and the sordid were inseparable. The letter in itself, site of the Cadaver Synod, reflected this duality. Once the grand palace of popes, it had become a fortress, its halls echoing less with prayer than with the clash of factions. To imagine Formosus's corpse enthroned there is to see Rome's contradictions crystallized. Sacred vestments draped over decayed flesh, bishops gathered not for liturgy, but for political theatre, the building itself both church and courthouse. This atmosphere helps explain why Rome's people reacted with such disgust. They were not unaccustomed to intrigue or violence. Such things were common. But a trial of a corpse pushed beyond the unspoken limits of propriety. Desecrating the dead offended not only religious sensibilities but also Roman traditions of honor. It turned politics into farce, and in a city already weary of chaos, it was the absurdity more than the cruelty that proved intolerable. Stephen VI paid the price, but he was not the last pope to be swept up in turmoil. The years that followed saw a dizzying carousel of pontiffs. Romanus, Theodore II, John IX, Benedict IV, Leovarth, Christopher, and eventually Sergius III. Many ruled for months rather than years. Some deposed violently, others fading into obscurity. The papacy in this period is sometimes described by historians as the saeculum obscurum, the Dark Age, when the throne of Peter seemed less like a rock and more like a chair balanced precariously on water. Amid all this, the Cadaver Synod lingered in memory. It was cited again and again in arguments, invoked by rivals, used as shorthand for papal corruption. Even in times when the Church tried to project dignity, the image of a corpse on trial haunted the institution. Rome could change popes, annul decisions, rebuild alliances, but it could not erase the memory of what had been done in the Lateran. The murmuring city carried that memory in whispers along its streets and into the records of chroniclers. Thus, the Cadaver Synod was not an isolated grotesquerie, but a symptom of Rome's larger turmoil. It showed what could happen when politics consumed the papacy, when noble rivalries turned holy offices into pawns, and when desperation led leaders to gestures so extreme they undermined the very authority they sought to protect. Rome in the late 9th century was a city in search of stability, and the corpse of Formosus became a strange, unsettling emblem of how far that search had gone astray. From the narrow streets of Rome, the ripples of the Cadaver Synod spread outward across Europe, carried by letters, gossip, and the ever-present movements of clergy and merchants. What happened in the Lateran was too bizarre, too scandalous, to remain a purely local affair. Word that a pope's corpse had been dug up, dressed in robes, tried, mutilated, and hurled into the river soon reached other courts, and the effect was more corrosive than clarifying. For kings and bishops beyond the Alps, the trial of Formosus raised uncomfortable questions about the papacy itself. If one pope could declare another's acts void, what did that mean for the crowns placed on emperors' heads? Arnulf of Carinthia had been crowned by Formosus. Was his imperial title valid, or was it a hollow gesture undone by a corpse's condemnation? If the ordinations of bishops by Formosus were null, then entire diocese were effectively leaderless, and sacraments administered under those bishops' authority came under suspicion. The uncertainty struck at the very foundations of church order. Bishops in Germany and France, many of them sympathetic to Arnulf and hostile to the Spulators, viewed the Cadaver Synod with alarm. They feared not only chaos, but precedent. If popes could overturn the legitimacy of their predecessors, the continuity of apostolic succession, the bedrock of Catholic authority, looked fragile indeed. Church unity depended on the assumption that ordinations and sacraments were valid regardless of later politics. By tampering with that principle, Stephen VI had undermined not only Formosus, but the papacy's credibility everywhere. Theologians and canon lawyers wrestled with the implications. Some argued that even if a pope was unworthy, his sacramental acts remained valid, a principle later summed up in the doctrine that the validity of sacraments does not depend on the personal holiness of the minister. Others, more radical, took the Cadaver Synod as evidence that Rome had lost its way. For those inclined to distrust papal authority, the trial of a corpse was proof that the supposed rock of Peter had cracked. In Constantinople, where relations with Rome were already strained, news of the Synod likely confirmed suspicions that the Western Church was chaotic and corrupt. Byzantine chroniclers, while not always well informed on Roman affairs, relished tales that reinforced their sense of superiority. To them, the image of a dead pope dragged before a tribunal was less shocking than it was confirming, a sign that Rome's pretensions to primacy were laughable. Even among ordinary Christians, word of the Cadaver Synod filtered into rumor and folklore. Stories of the Tiber rejecting Formosus's body, or miracles at his reburial, gave the episode a legendary aura. The image of a pope dishonored in death, yet vindicated by divine signs, resonated with a population accustomed to interpreting events through the lens of providence. To many, the earthquake that struck Rome, not long after Stephen's Synod, seemed divine commentary, heaven itself protesting the absurdity staged in the Lateran. Yet the strangest reverberation lay in Rome itself. Successive popes alternated between condemning and rehabilitating Formosus, as if compelled to keep reopening the wound. Each reversal sent waves of uncertainty outward again, forcing bishops and kings to recalibrate their stance. For decades, Christendom found itself caught in a bizarre echo chamber, with a corpse's legacy endlessly debated as if it still held office. Practical effects also lingered. Some clerics ordained by Formosus had to be reordained under later popes, a humiliating admission that their status was disputed. Others resisted, insisting their authority remained valid. Disputes arose in councils and synods, draining energy from other matters. The Church's attention, instead of turning outward to reform or mission, remained fixated on the ghost of Formosus, whose trial had tangled canon law in knots. By the time Sergius III recondemned Formosus in 904, Christendom had grown weary of the saga. The constant back and forth reduced papal rulings to little more than political maneuvers. Far from strengthening Rome's authority, the Cadaver Synod had exposed it as fragile, contingent on whichever faction controlled the city. In distant lands, bishops might still honor the Pope's office, but they did so with less reverence than before, aware that the papacy could be as unstable and absurd as any feuding court. The reverberations of the Cadaver Synod were thus not only political, but spiritual. It seeded doubt about the permanence of sacraments, the continuity of the papacy, and the dignity of Rome itself. In later centuries, reformers and critics would look back on it as a grotesque emblem of what could go wrong when politics devoured religion. For contemporaries, however, it was less a lesson than a headache, an endless echo of uncertainty that made even the most faithful wonder how much authority could be trusted when a corpse could sit on trial. Gliding further into the tale, one cannot escape the sheer theatricality of the Cadaver Synod. It was not only a trial, but a performance, staged as much for spectacle as for justice. Rome, with its long memory of imperial ceremony and Christian ritual, knew the power of public display. In this case, however, the display crossed into grotesque parody, making the Lateran Basilica resemble less a courtroom than a macabre playhouse. Consider the staging. A corpse, 9 months buried, was exhumed and dressed in papal vestments. The body was enthroned in full regalia, as though it were presiding rather than accused. To keep it upright, attendants had to prop it in place, stiff limbs refusing to bend, the air thick with the smell of decay. One deacon was appointed to answer for the corpse, his voice the hollow ventriloquism of a dead pope. Around them sat bishops as judges, their robes rustling, their expressions surely uneasy. At the center stood Stephen VI, raging at the silence of the grave, asking questions to which no answer could ever come. The absurdity was both comic and horrifying. Chroniclers record Stephen's fury, his accusations shouted at the corpse, his insistence that Formosus had never been pope, his demand that all his acts be undone. The dead man's silence only heightened the strangeness. Here was a court that could not lose, for the accused could not speak. Yet the very lopsidedness of the trial turned it into theatre, justice performed, not delivered. Rome, accustomed to ceremony, must have found the scene deeply unsettling. Religious ritual depended on symbols, vestments, thrones, gestures, relics. But in the Cadaver Synod, those same symbols were inverted. Vestments that normally signified sanctity became costumes for mockery. A throne meant for authority became a prop for humiliation. Instead of relics honored as holy remains, a corpse was desecrated, its body made into evidence. What should have been sacred was twisted into farce, leaving observers unsure whether to laugh, cry, or recoil. It is telling that later chroniclers often described the Synod with a mixture of disgust and fascination. Some emphasized its grotesque humor, as though the trial were too absurd to take seriously. Others painted it as tragedy, a moment when the dignity of the papacy sank to its lowest ebb. Either way, the memory stuck not because of its legality, but because of its theatricality. The Cadaver Synod was unforgettable, precisely because it was absurd. The absurdity extended beyond the trial itself. When the corpse was stripped of papal robes, the gesture carried echoes of a king unthroned or a priest defrocked. Cutting off the blessing fingers was another symbolic inversion, turning instruments of sanctity into proof of guilt. Dragging the body through Rome's streets completed the drama, making the city itself an unwilling audience. And when the corpse was flung into the Tiber, it was both disposal and encore, a final act designed to erase Formosus by drowning his memory in the city's river. Yet, as theatre, it failed. Instead of erasure, it created legend. The image of the trial was so grotesque that it could not be forgotten. Far from destroying Formosus' reputation, it immortalized him. Far from strengthening Stephen VI's authority, it made him appear deranged or desperate. And far from stabilizing Rome, it pushed the city into deeper turmoil, as mobs turned against the Pope who had made them witnesses to such macabre spectacle. In a sense, the Cadaver Synod revealed the dangers of confusing ritual with justice. Rome had long relied on elaborate gestures to express authority: coronations, processions, councils. But in 1897, the gestures went awry. Instead of inspiring reverence, they provoked ridicule. Instead of affirming order, they displayed chaos. Instead of elevating the papacy, they reduced it to burlesque. The Lateran Basilica, once the seat of solemn liturgy, became the stage of a morbid farce. Those who left the Synod carried with them not the verdict of law, but the memory of a dead pope propped on a throne. And long after Stephen VI himself was dead, strangled in prison, the image remained. Rome could rehabilitate Formosus, annul the trial, restore dignity, but it could never unsee the absurdity staged that day. The Cadaver Synod, then, was less a moment of justice than a moment of theatre, grotesque, unforgettable, absurd. It left behind no clear precedent, no useful doctrine, only the unsettling reminder that when politics devours religion, the stage may end up filled with corpses dressed in robes, while the living squabble over shadows. Drifting onward from the theatre of the absurd, the Cadaver Synod invites reflection on what it revealed about the papacy itself. Rome in the 9th century was not the towering power it would later become, but rather a fragile institution, hemmed in by noble families, foreign rulers, and its own contradictions. The trial of a corpse was not merely grotesque, it was symptomatic of an office that had lost its footing, where symbols of authority could be twisted into weapons, and stability was never more than temporary. The papacy had long claimed universality. Popes styled themselves as successors of Peter, guardians of Christendom, arbiters between kings. Yet, in the years around the Cadaver Synod, that grandeur was largely a facade. In practice, the Pope's authority stretched only as far as his alliances could carry him. German kings, Italian dukes, and Roman nobles all competed to control the office, turning the throne of Peter into a prize. In such an atmosphere, legitimacy was always precarious, and enemies were quick to undermine it, even after death. Formosus's corpse became the most vivid expression of this fragility. By placing a dead pope on trial, Stephen VI unwittingly revealed how little stability the office possessed. If the dignity of the papacy could not even protect its holder in the grave, how could it protect the living? If ordinations and coronations could be erased with a shout, what permanence did the Church offer? Instead of reinforcing authority, the Cadaver Synod displayed its hollowness, its dependence on faction and force rather than unshakable continuity. For the Roman people, the trial underlined a truth they already knew. The papacy was as vulnerable to intrigue as any other throne. Mobs rose and fell, popes were installed and strangled, and the corpse of Formicius became merely the most grotesque casualty of a broader instability. For the wider church, however, the episode was a warning that Rome's sacred claims could be undermined by its own behavior. Respect for papal authority had always rested, partly on perception, on the belief that the Pope stood above petty faction. The Cadaver Synod shattered that illusion, showing the world a Pope raging at a corpse while Rome looked on in disbelief. The fragility extended into doctrine. The disputes over Formicius's ordinations and sacraments forced theologians to clarify principles that would later become standard. That the validity of sacraments does not depend on the worthiness of the minister. It was a sobering lesson wrung from scandal. Rome had unintentionally forced itself, and the wider church, to grapple with the possibility that human weakness, even corruption, could not invalidate the grace of God. The Cadaver Synod, absurd as it was, pushed the church toward articulating resilience in spite of its leaders' failings. Yet fragility remained the dominant note. Popes continued to rise and fall with dizzying speed in the decades that followed. Some ruled for months, others for days. Few left lasting marks beyond the circumstances of their demise. The office looked less like a throne of Peter and more like a chair balanced precariously on the tides of Roman politics. The corpse of Formosus, dragged from grave to throne, embodied this instability better than any chronicle could. And yet, fragility did not mean collapse. The papacy survived, its reputation dimmed, its authority questioned, its dignity mocked. But it endured. The Lateran still hosted councils, pilgrims still came to Rome, kings still sought papal blessing. The Cadaver Synod was a low point, but it was not the end. Like the corpse it desecrated, the papacy seemed to rise again, after humiliation, clothed in fresh vestments, carried onward by the momentum of tradition and necessity. Perhaps that is the strangest lesson of all, that even absurdity did not break the institution. Rome could stagger, popes could rage at corpses, mobs could drag pontiffs to prison, but the church itself moved forward. The fragility of its leaders did not erase its endurance. The Cadaver Synod became a symbol of shame, but also a symbol of survival, a reminder that institutions can stumble into grotesque theater and still carry on. The canals of Roman politics murmured with intrigue, the streets echoed with mob cries, and the basilicas bore witness to scandal. Through it all, the papacy remained, fragile yet persistent, its dignity wounded, but its continuity intact. The Cadaver Synod was proof not only of the absurd lengths men would go to in pursuit of power, but also of the paradox that even at its weakest, the papacy endured, dragging its shadows along with it into the centuries. Settling now into the final chapter, the Cadaver Synod rests less as an episode of 9th century politics and more as a symbol lodged in memory. It is recalled not for the subtleties of canon law, nor for the exact alliances of Spolotos and Arnulfines, but for its grotesque image, a corpse enthroned, a pope shouting at silence, Bishops gathered around a spectacle that looked more like parody than judgment. So memory has endured for more than 1,000 years precisely because it captured the uneasy truth that power, when untethered, can consume even the dignity of the dead. In later centuries, the Synod was retold as a cautionary tale. Medieval chroniclers shook their heads, calling it madness. Renaissance writers, with their flair for drama, emphasized its grotesque theatricality. Protestant reformers in the 16th century gleefully pointed to it as proof that Rome had always been corrupt, citing the corpse trial as evidence that the papacy was capable of absurdities as much as sanctities. Modern historians, sifting through sparse and sometimes contradictory sources, still return to it, uneasy at how real it was and how revealing. The Cadaver Synod is not merely remembered as scandal, but as metaphor. It shows how institutions can turn symbols into weapons, how the need for legitimacy can twist ritual into spectacle, how politics can reach so deep that even graves are not safe. It is a story of vengeance pursued beyond death, of rivals unwilling to let go, of a city so consumed by faction that the sacred was made into theatre. Rome in 1897 was a place where shadow triumphed over dignity, if only for a moment, leaving behind a stain that centuries of reform could never quite erase. And yet, like many dark episodes, it also left strange gifts. The chaos forced the Church to confront questions of sacramental validity, to articulate principles that endured long after the factions of Rome had faded. The absurdity of the Synod, by shocking conscience, helped shape the conviction that God's grace could not be undone by human folly. In its grotesque way, the trial of a corpse helped define resilience amid corruption. Today, to recall the Cadaver Synod is to be reminded that history is not a steady march of dignity, but a jumble of brilliance and absurdity, reverence and farce. The papacy would rise again to grandeur, claiming universal sway and building cathedrals that touched the sky. But it could never quite erase the memory of that day in the Lateran when a dead pope sat trial. The image lingers like a whisper in the vaults of history, unsettling, unforgettable, murmuring that even the holiest institutions are built from human clay. And so the story ends where it began, with a corpse in a throne and a city watching. The Cadaver Synod stands not as an isolated oddity, but as a shadow cast across centuries, reminding us that power can distort, dignity can collapse, and memory will always carry the echo. The corpse of Formosus could not answer Stephen's accusations, but in silence it gave the only testimony that mattered, showing the world the folly of those who mistake vengeance for justice. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.